The Wishing Well by E.F. Benson. E.F. Benson, 1867 to 1940, is still remembered in Rye, where he was the mayor and also the occupant for many years of Lamb House, whose original tenant was Henry James. They became friends after Benson wrote asking James for a critical opinion of his work. Lamb House must have provided inspiration for ghost stories, as there is a haunting attached to its history, and Benson himself reports seeing a cloaked figure in the garden. The Wishing Well is set in Benson's other spiritual home, Cornwall, where he spent much of his youth and subsequently set many of his tales. This is a splendid story of unrequited love, vengeance, and witchcraft, in which Benson exploits his talents to the full. I am Tony Walker, and this is the Classic Ghost Stories podcast.
What's the secret?
The Wishing Well by E.F. Benson. The village of St. Gervais lies at the seaward base of that broad triangular valley which lies scooped out among the uplands of the North Cornish moors, and not even among the fells of Cumberland could you find so remote a cluster of human habitations. 4 miles of by-road, steep and stony, lies between it and the highway, along which in tourist time the motor buses pound dustily to Bude and Newquay, and 8 more separate it from the railhead. Scarcely once in the summer does an inquisitive traveller think it worthwhile to visit a village which his guidebook dismisses with the very briefest reference to the ancient wishing well that lies near the lich gate of the graveyard there. The world, in fact, takes very little heed of St. Gervais, and St. Gervais hardly more of the outer world. Seldom do you see man or woman waiting at the corner where the road from the village joins the highway for the advent of the motor bus, and seldom does it pause there to set down one of its passengers. An occasional trolley laden with sacks of coal and cargo of beer barrels jolts heavily down the lane, for the rest of the farms of the valley and the kitchen gardens of the cottagers supply it with the needs of life, and its few fishing boats bring in their harvest from the sea. Nor does St. Gervais seek after any fruits of science or culture or religion, save such as spring from its soil, which furnishes its wise women with herbs of healing for ailing bodies, and from its tradition of spells and superstition of a darker sort to be used in the service of love or of vengeance. These latter are not publicly spoken of, save in one house at St. Gervais, but are muttered and whispered in quiet conversations. And thus the knowledge has been handed down from mother to daughter since the days when, 3 centuries ago, a screeching, handcuffed band of women were driven from here to Bodmin, and, after a parody of a trial, burned at the stake. It was strange that the vicarage, which might have been expected to be unblackened by the smoke of legendary learning, was the one house where magic and witchcraft were openly and sedulously studied. But such study was purely academical, the Reverend Lionel Eustace being the foremost authority in England as a writer on folklore. His parochial duties were light and his leisure plentiful, for a couple of services on Sunday were, to judge by the congregation, sufficient for the spiritual needs of his parish, and for the rest of the week he was busy in the library of the creeper-covered vicarage that stood hard by the lich gate that led to the churchyard. Here, patient but unremitting, he worked at his great book on witchcraft, which had engaged him so many years, occasionally printing some subsection of it as a pamphlet. The Origin of the Witch's Broomstick, for instance, had furnished curious reading. He was a wealthy man with no expensive taste, save that for books on his subject, and the big library he had built onto the vicarage had now but few empty shelves. 20 years ago, when ill health had driven him from the chill clays of Cambridge, he had been appointed to this remote college living, and the warm, soft climate and the strange, primitive traditions that hung about the place suited both his health and his hobby. Mr. Eustace had long been a widower, and his daughter Judith, now a woman of 40 years old, kept house for him. The time of her more marriageable maidenhood had been spent here in complete isolation from her own class, and though sometimes, when she saw the courtships and childbirths of the village, the sense of what she had missed made a bitter brew for her, she had long known that St. Gervais had cast some spell upon her, and that had a wooer from without sought her, he must indeed be a magnet to her heart, if he could draw her from this secluded valley into the world that lay beyond the moors. In the few visits she had paid to relations of her father and mother, she had always pined to be home again, and to wake to the glinting of the sun on the gorse-clad hills, or to the bellowing roar of some westerly gale that threw the sheets of rain against the window. A stormy day at home was worth all the alien sunshine, and the sandy beach of the bay, with the waves asleep or toppling in foam-laced and thunderous, was better than the brilliance of southern seas. Here alone her mind knew that background of content which is brighter than all the pleasures the world offers. Here every day the spell of St. Gervais was like some magic shuttle weaving its threads through her. Since her mother's death, Judith's days had been of a uniform monotony. Household cares claimed a short hour of the morning, and then she went to the library where her father worked to transcribe his works, if he had a section of his work ready for dictation, or to look up endless references in the volumes that lined the room, if he was preparing the notes which formed the material of his dictation. Some branch of witchcraft was always the subject of it, some magical rite for the fertility of the cattle, some charm for childbearing, some filter for love, or, what had by degrees got to interest her most, one that caused the man on whom a girl's heart was set, but who had naught for her, to wither in the grip of some nameless sickness and miserably to perish. Month by month, as her father pushed his patient way forward through the ancient mists, these satanic spells that blighted grew to be a fascination with Judith. Just now he was deep in an exploration into wishing wells, and there she sat this morning, pencil in hand for his dictation, as he walked up and down the library, glancing now and then at his memoranda spread out on the table. "These wishing wells," he said, "are common to the whole of early European beliefs, but nowhere do we find that the power which supposedly presided over them was at the beck and call of any chance persons who invoked their efficacy. Only witches and those who had occult powers could set the spell working, and the origin of that spell was undoubtedly satanic, and not till Christian times were these wells used for any purpose but that of invoking evil. The form of these wells is curiously similar. An arch or shelter of stonework is invariably built over them, and in the sides are cut small niches where, in Christian days, candles were placed or thank offerings deposited. What they were previously used for is uncertain, but they were, beyond doubt, connected with the evil spells, and I conjecture that the name of the person devoted to destruction was scratched on a coin or written on a slip of linen or paper to await the action of the diabolical power. The most perfectly preserved of these wishing wells known to me is that of St. Gervais in Cornwall. Its arched shelter is in excellent condition, and the well, as is usual, very deep. The local belief in its efficacy has survived to this day, though its power is never invoked, as far as I can ascertain, for evil purposes. A woman in pregnancy, for instance, will drink of the well and pray beside it. A girl whose lover has gone to sea will scratch her name on a silver coin and drop it into the water, thus ensuring his safe return. The village folk are curiously reticent about such practices, but I can personally vouch for cases of this kind. He paused, fingering the short Van Dyke beard that grew greyly from his chin. "My dear, I wonder if that is quite discreet," he said to Judith. "But, after all, it is highly improbable that any copy of my work published by the University at a guinea will find its way here. I think I will chance it. Dear me, the bell for luncheon already. We will resume our work this evening, if you are at leisure, as I have much ready for dictation." Judith smiled to herself as she paged the sheets. She knew very much more about her father's parishioners than he, for he, scholar, recluse and parson, only lived on the fringe of their lives, whereas she, in chatty visits to the women who sat and knitted at their cottage doors, had got into real touch with an inner life to which he was a stranger. She knew, for instance, that old Sally Trenair, whose death less than a week ago had been a source of such relief to her neighbours, was universally held to be a witch, and Sally was always muttering and mumbling round the wishing well. None who crossed her will prospered. Their cows went dry or threw stillborn calves. Their sheep wilted. The atrocious henbane, fatal to cattle, appeared in their fields. So the prudent wished Sally a polite good day, and sent her honey from their hives and a cut of prime bacon when the pig was killed. But from some vein of secretiveness, Judith did not tell her father of such talk, whispered to her over the knitting needles, which would have inclined him to modify his view about the surviving association of the wishing well with evil invocations. It was idle gossip, perhaps, for if you had challenged her to say whether she believed such tales of old Sally, she would certainly have denied it. And yet something deep down in her would have whispered, I don't only believe, I know. Today, when luncheon was finished, her father returned to his desk and Judith started to walk a couple of miles up the valley to the farm of John Penarth, whose family from time immemorial had owned these rich acres. For the last 8 years, he and his wife had lived there alone, for their only son Stephen had gone out to America at the age of 16 to seek his fortune. But fortune had not sought him, and now, when his father was growing old and his health declining, Stephen was coming home with the intention of settling down here. Judith remembered him well, a big, handsome boy, with the blue of the sea in his eyes and the sunshine in his hair, and she wondered into what sort of man he would have grown. She had heard that he was already home, but though she was curious to see him, the motive for her visit was really the same as that which so often drew her to the Penarth farm, namely, to have a talk with Stephen's mother. There was no one, thought Judith, who was so learned in what was truly worth knowing as Mrs. Penarth. She couldn't have pointed you India on the big globe that stood in her parlour, or have answered the simplest board school question about Queen Elizabeth, or have added 5 to 4 without counting on her fingers. But she had rarer knowledge in the stead of such trivialities. She had the healing touch for man and beast. She stroked an ailing cow, and next day it would be at pasture again. She whispered in the ear of a feverish child, plucking gently at its forehead, and pulled the headache out so that the child slept. And she, alone of all the village, paid no court to Sally Trenair, nor sought to propitiate her. One day, as she passed Sally's cottage, Sally had screamed curses on her and followed her, yelling halfway to the farm. Then suddenly Mrs. Penarth had turned and shot out her finger at her. Grach nos os ta, havel a war pub on it. You silly tipsy old crone, she had cried. Down on your knees and crave my pardon, and then get home and don't cross my way again. Sure enough, Sally knelt on the stones and slunk off home, and thereafter, if Mrs. Penarth was down in the village, she would make haste to get into her cottage and shut the door. Mrs. Penarth, it seemed, knew more than Sally. Judith swung her easy way up the steep hill, hatless in spite of the hot sun, and unbreathed by the ascent. She was a tall woman, black-haired and comely, her skin clear and healthy, with the bloom on it that only sun and air can give. Her full-lipped mouth hinted that passion smouldered there. Her eyebrows, fine and level, nearly met across the base of her forehead. Her eyes, big and black, looked ever so slightly inwards. So small was the convergence that it was no disfigurement. When she looked directly at you, it wasn't perceptible, but if she was immersed in her own thoughts, then it was there. Most noticeable was it when her father was dictating to her some grim story of malign magic or witchcraft. But now she had come to the paved road through the garden of the farmhouse, set with flowers and herbs in front of the espaliered apple trees, and there was Mrs. Penarth knitting in the shade of the house during these hot hours before she went out again to chicken run and milking shed. But you're a welcome sight, Miss Judith," she said in the soft Cornish speech, "and you hatless in the sun as ever. But indeed, you're one of the wise who've made the sun and rain your friends, and 'tis far you'd have to search ere you found better. Come in, dear soul, and have a glass of currant water after your walk, and tell me the goings-on down at St. Gervais." Judith always fell into their mode of speech when she was with the native folk. "Sure, there's little to tell," she said. "There was a grand catch 2 days agone, and yesterday was the burying of old Sally Trenair." Mrs. Penarth pulled out for her a glass of the clear ruby liquor for which she was famous. "Strange how the folk was scared of that tipsy old poppet," she said. She had now but a few rhymes to gabble and a foul tongue to flap at them. A tale of curses she blew off at me one day, and I doubt not she hid my name in the wishing well, though I never troubled to look. Hid your name in the wishing well? Asked Judith, thinking of the morning's dictation. Mrs. Penarth shot a swift, oblique glance at her. There were certain things she had noticed about Judith, and they interested her. "Oh, my dear, you've sure got too much sense and book learning to heed such tales," she said. "But when I was a girl, my mother used to talk of them. Even now I scarce know what to make of such strange things." "Oh, tell me of them," said Judith. "My father's just set on the wishing wells and the lore of them. He was dictating to me of them all the morning." "Hey, to think of that. Well, when I was a girl, there were many queer doings round the well. A maid would tell an old crone like Sally if she fancied a young man and get some gabble to con over as she sipped the water. Or if a fellow had an ill will towards another, he'd consult a witch woman, and she'd write the name of his enemy for him and bid him hide it in the well. And then, sure as eve or morning, tribulations drove fast on him, and as long as his name bided there, his cows would go dry, or his boat be wrecked, or his children get deadly dwams, or his wife break her marriage vows, or he himself would pine and fail till he was scarce able to put foot to floor, and presently the bell would be tolling for him. Idle tale, no doubt. Judith had been drinking this in, eager as the thirsty earth drinks the rain after drought, or as a starving man sets his teeth in food. Her mouth smiled, her blood beat high and strong. It was as if she was learning some news of good fortune which was hers by birthright. Just then there came a step in the passage and the door opened. "Why, 'tis Stephen," said Mrs. Penarth. "Come, lad, and pay your duty to Miss Judith. Maybe she remembers you." Tall as she was, he towered over her. He had a boy's face still, and the sea was in his eyes and the sun in his hair. And on the instant Judith knew that no magnet of man would avail to draw her from St. Gervais. There was dictation again for her up till summertime, and when, after that, her father went back to his books, she strolled out, as she often did on hot nights like this, before going to bed. Never yet had she felt so strong an emotional excitement as that afternoon when Mrs. Penarth, talking of those old beliefs of her girlhood, had somehow revealed Judith to herself. All that narrative about the wishing well was already familiar to some secret cell in her brain. She only needed to be reminded of it to make it her own. And on top of that had come Stephen's entry, and her heart had leaped to him. Some mixed brew of these two was at ferment within her now. Sometimes a bubble from one, sometimes from the other rose luminous to the surface. She felt restless and tingling with stored energy, and she paused for a moment at the gate of the garden, uncertain how to spend it. The night was thickly overcast, the road that led down to the village a riband of grey scarcely visible, and as she stood there she heard a step, brisk and active, coming along it, and there, swung into view, recognizable even in the deep dusk by his height and gait, the figure of Stephen on his way to the village. Dearly would she have loved to call to him and walk with him, but that could not be. Besides, another desire tugged at her, and when he was past, she turned in at the lich gate to the churchyard. The white tombstones glimmered faintly in the dusk, and she looked up beyond them towards the grave by which she had stood 2 days ago at the burying of old Sally. Then her breath caught in her throat, for she could see the mound of new-turned earth gleaming whitely. She made her way to it. This dark earth was certainly luminous with some wavering light, and on the moment she was conscious that Sally herself, not the mere bag of bones that had been put away in the earth, was close to her. So vivid was this impression that she whispered, "Sally? Are you there, Sally?" No audible response came, but the answer tingled in every nerve in her body, and she knew that Sally was here. No pale, wandering spirit, but a power friendly and sisterly, and altogether evil. It was trickling into her, growing warm in her veins as by some transfusion of blood. She went to the wishing well, and kneeling on the curbstone of it, drank of its water from her cupped hands. Something stirred beside her, and turning, she saw at her side, illuminated by some pale gleam, a little bent figure, shrouded in clean grave clothes, and the brown, wizened face, which she had last beheld in the composure and dignity of death, now all alive with glee and with welcome. And her flesh was weak, for in a spasm of terror she sprang to her feet with arms flung out against the spectre, and lo, there was nothing there but the quiet churchyard with the headstones of those who slumbered there, and at her feet the black, invisible water of which she had drunk. Despising herself for the fright, and yet winged with it, she ran stumbling from the place, not halting till she was back at the vicarage, where the light shining from the library window showed that her father was still pursuing his academic researches into the world of things occult and terrible, of which the doors were now swinging open to admit her in very truth. For some days, the horror of that moment by the well was effective, and she threw herself into the normal ways of life, which lured her with a new brightness. She often saw Stephen, for it was he who brought the milk of a morning from the farm, and she would be out in the garden by the time of his early arrival, cutting roses for her vases, or more strenuously engaged in weeding the borders. At first, she gave him just a nodded "Good morning," but soon they would stand chatting there for 5 minutes. She knew she made a fine, handsome figure. She saw he appreciated her healthy splendor. He looked at her with the involuntary tribute a man pays to a good-looking woman. Fond, wild notions took root in her mind, spreading their fibers beneath in the soil and anchoring there. Another morning she heard him singing as he clattered down the road in the milk cart, a big, rough, resonant voice of high pitch for a man. Judith played the organ in church, conducting a choir practice every Saturday for the singers, and next week Stephen was sitting among the men while she took them through the canticles and hymns. Women and girls took alto and treble parts. The chief chorister was Nance Pascoe, a maid of 20, and she was like a folded rosebud just bursting into full flower. By some blind instinct, Judith began to dislike her. She would stop in the middle of a verse to tell the trebles they were flat, which meant that Nance was the culprit. Again, she would ask the tenors singly to sing some line over which they had bungled, and had a word of praise for Stephen. Or she would go to the farm for a chat with Mrs. Penarth, and by some casual questions learn that Stephen was hedge-clipping nearby in the meadow. Then she would remember she wanted a chicken for next day and go to tell him. It was but a step. In 100 infinitesimal ways she betrayed herself. Mixed with this growth of longing which had so firmly rooted itself was another of more poisonous breed. There was a power eager to help her, and like a frightened fool she had fled from its manifestation. But she knew now she was making no way with Stephen, and now she bethought herself again of it, and found that her terror had withered, and that her thirst for commerce with these dark enchantments was keen, not only for the help they could give her, but for her own love of them. Once more in the evening, when her father was back at his books, she set out for the wishing well. Her step was noiseless on the grass of the churchyard, and she was close to the wishing well, still screened by bushes that grew there, when she heard from behind them a ringing man's laugh, and a girl's voice joined in. "Sure she's terrible set on you, Stephen. It makes me bubble within when she says at the choir singing, 'Yes, very nice, Mr. Penarth.' And what the poor soul means is, 'Ah, Stephen, do 'ee come here and give me a hug?'" Stephen laughed again. "I'm fair scared of her," he said, though mother laughs fit to burst when she's come up to the farm to see and order one egg or a sprig of mint. And every morning when I take the milk, the old girl be weeding and hoeing, showing off like, as if she was a strong man at the fair. I declare I'm sorry for her," says Nance, "for I know what it is to love you, poor empty heart." "Nance, we must put our banns up," said he. "I'm scared, but give your lad a kiss to strengthen him, and I'll pluck up and ask Parson to read us out next Sunday." There was silence. "Hey, Stephen, don't hug so tight," whispered Nance. "You'll get your fill of me ere long. Just a drink from the well for us both, and then I must go home." Judith stole back along the grass, and from behind the curtain in the parlour window saw the two, arm entwined, pass down the road. No thought was there now in her mind of any love filled her. No longer did she want the help of a friendly power to get Stephen. He had mocked at her. He was scared of her, and soon he would have good reason for that. Of Nance she hardly thought. It was not for Nance that her heart was black as the water in the wishing well. She felt no hysterical rage or longing for revenge. It was a hellish glee that fed her soul. Quaint and pleasant was it, she thought, as she wrote on a slip of paper the name Stephen Penarth, that it should have been his mother who taught her that. Mrs. Penarth had laughed fit to burst at her, so Mrs. Penarth must learn not to laugh so much. She went forth with the inscribed slip. The power she courted was flooding into her wave on wave. Now she was back at the well again, and there she knelt a moment, drinking in, like a thirsty field, the dew of power with which the air was thick. She felt in the darkness for one of those fern-fringed niches in the wall, and deep among its fronds she hid the paper. "Master of evil and of me," she muttered, "send sickness and death on him whom I here dedicate." Something stirred beside her. She knew that the presence which had terrified her before was manifest again. She turned with hands of welcome, and there beside her was the shroud-wrapped figure and the wizened face. But now the shroud was white no longer, but spotted with earth mould, and the flesh was rotting from the face. Judith put her hands close round the spectre and kissed the frayed lips fretted with decay, and she felt it melting into her. She shut her eyes in the ecstasy of that union. When she opened them, she was clasping the empty air. She was down early next morning, full of youthful fire and fitness, and presently the milk cart clattered up to the gate. But it was not Stephen who drove it, but Mrs. Penarth. "'Tis I who've come with your milk today, Miss Judith," she said, "for Stephen's got a terrible bad headache, and I bade him lie abed, but he charged me to ask Parson to put up his banns come Sunday." "Oh, is Stephen to be married?" asked Judith. "Who's the maid?" "Just Nance Pascoe, whom he's played with since he was a lad." "Then he's lucky," said Judith, "for she's pretty as a picture. I'll tell my father about the banns, and I'm so sorry Mr. Stephen's not well, but he'll mend quick." The days passed on, and soon it was seen that Stephen lay stricken with some sore fever, to which neither his mother's healing hands nor the doctor's potions brought relief. Every morning Judith learned from Mrs. Penarth that he was no better, and every morning she felt herself the object of some keen, silent scrutiny. She was not one who prinked before her glass, but one day, after Mrs. Penarth had gone, she ran upstairs and questioned her face. It certainly had changed. It was sharper in outline, and that cast in her eye was surely more pronounced. But she liked that. It seemed an outward and visible sign of her power. Every night now she sat by the wishing well, concentrating on her desire. The news of Stephen had been joyfully bad that day. His fever had burned more fiercely, consuming the flesh on his bones and drinking up his strength. Twice now had his banns been called, but it was not likely that he would go to church next as a bridegroom. The moon was soon to rise as Judith got up to go home. She fancied she heard something stir in the bushes by the well, and called, "Sally! Sally!" but no response came. Her limbs were light with joy. She danced along the strip of turf, leaping high in the air for the very exuberance of her soul. And soon, as she turned out of the lych gate, Mrs. Penarth stole out of the bushes. She had a dark lantern with her, and she searched the walls of the wishing well. She spied the paper Judith had hidden there, and she drew it out and read it. She tore it in half, and on the blank piece She wrote another name and put it back exactly where it had been. That night Stephen slept well and long, and in the morning, even as Judith had surmised, he was mending quick. Judith was not in the garden at the milk hour to hear the favourable report, and later in the day Dr. Addis was called in. He found her suffering from just such an attack of fever as he had been attending for the past fortnight. It puzzled him, but his treatment of the other patient was proving successful, and he assured her father there was no cause for alarm. Fevers ran their course, and Judith's fever ran its course even more fiercely. She was lying in her bed facing the window 10 days after she had been taken ill. She knew that the power she had absorbed into her when she embraced that spectral horror by the wishing well was being drained out of her by some vaster potency, which, vampire-like, was drinking up her own vitality as well. She had been conscious all day, but often she had seen waveringly like the flame of a candle blown this way and that in the draught, the dim semblance of that shrouded figure round which she had cast her welcoming arms. It seemed to be still attached to her by some band of filmy whiteness, and to be incomplete. But about the hour of sunset, she saw that the spectre stood by her bed, fully formed and severed from her. The face was now deeply pitted by corruption, and it floated away from her and drifted out of the window. She was left here, human once more, but sick unto death. She remembered how she had written Stephen's name and dedicated him to the power of the wishing well. Yet, what had come of that? For the last week now, Stephen had brought the morning's milk, hale and handsome, with inquiries about her from his mother. Could it be, she questioned herself, that she had failed in some point of that damnable ritual, and that what she had written was active not for his doom, but for hers? It would be wise to destroy that slip of paper, if she could only get to it. Not because she had ceased to wish him evil, but from the fear that it was her vitality that was being drained from her on that fruitless purpose. She got out of bed, giddy with weakness, and managed to get into a skirt and jersey and slip her feet into her shoes. The house was quiet, and step by step she struggled downstairs and to the door. The wholesome wind off the sea put a little life into her, and she shuffled along the strip of turf down which she had danced and capered, and which lay between the lich gate and the well. She passed round the screen of bushes, and there, on the stone bench, was Stephen's mother. She rose as Judith appeared and curtsied. "Oh dear, why you look poorly indeed, Miss Judith," she said. "Is it wise for you to come out to the wishing well too? There have been strange doings there." "I'll be mending soon," said Judith. "A drink from the wishing well was what I fancied." She knelt down on the curb, leaning one hand against the wall of the well, while with the other she felt among the ferns that fringed it. There was the slip of paper she had hidden, and she drew it forth. "Take your drink then, Miss Judith," said Mrs. Pennath. "Why, whatever have you found? That's a queer thing to have gotten. A slip of paper in it. Open it, dear soul. Maybe there's some good news in it." Judith crushed it up in her hand. There was no need for her to look, and even as she knelt there, she felt a sweet lightening and cooling of her fever come over her. Mrs. Pennath shot out her hand at her. "Open it, you slut, you paltry witch," she screamed. "Do my bidding." Judith opened it and read her own name written there. She tried to rise to her feet. She swayed and staggered, and she fell forward into the wishing well. It was very deep, and the sides of it were slippery with slime and water moss. Once she caught at the step on which she had knelt, but her fingers failed to grasp it, and she sank. Once after that she rose, and then there came a roaring in her ears, and to her eyes a blackness, and down her throat there poured the cool water of the wishing well.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies. that so?
You tried to get into the long road today, didn't you? You tried.
How do the dead come back? What's the secret?
I just got very sidetracked then in looking into how witches are portrayed and have been portrayed over the centuries in Western stories, that is to say, both mythological stories in Greek and Norse religion, and then, looking at Gothic fiction, looking at Macbeth, Goethe, and dancing around. Now, I realise I'm not going to have time to talk about any of those, so I've done a separate piece on that, which I've posted on the Patreon. I think it's public, so you don't have to be a patron to read it. Anyway, let's get back to the story. So, E.F. Benson. Probably, certainly among my favourite authors of the period and of this kind of story. Probably him and Edith Wharton are my favourites, I think. And then M.R. James, of course, and then we could do a big long list. I think I'll probably put Lovecraft in there somewhere, in the top 10 somewhere. I enjoyed the Lovecraft story I recently did. See how my mind's dancing again, never mind. E.F. Benson. Edward Frederick Benson. Now we've done, I think it was called Fred to his mates. I don't think he called them mates though. And he's opposed. And so we've done stories by him again, so you may have heard all this stuff. So he was born in 1867, 24th of July, at Wellington College in Berkshire, where his father was headmaster, I think, and he died in 1940, which must have been really bad for him because although he died at the beginning of 1940, so he hadn't seen the fall of France and he hadn't seen the terrible retreat from Dunkirk inflicted upon the British Army. Heroic though, in all those small boats went and saved the people, saved the soldiers, but things were looking fairly bleak, I think. It's a bad time to die. He died of throat cancer. Is there a good time to die? I don't know. So anyway, so let's talk about his life though. So he was the fifth child of Edward White Benson, a notable figure in the Church of England. He was also founder of the Ghost Club, his dad. I've said this before. He was Bishop of Truro, hence the Bensons being connected with Cornwall, growing up there, and he later became Archbishop of Canterbury, like the top dude in the Anglican Church. So he had his brothers Arthur Christopher, Robert Hugh, AC, and I've done an AC story. I haven't done a Robert Hugh. Robert R.H. Benson, I find his stories, because he became a Catholic priest, I think, and I think his stories are a little bit sermonizing. Sometimes they're kind of trying to make doctrinal points. And I think you always lose that. I think if you write a story and you're trying to get across a particular viewpoint that you have, whether it be on evolution or the future of cryptocurrency or whatever it is, or religion or politics, if you're trying to make your point and you're sermonizing to people, it's usually you lose the point of the story. I'm sure there are exceptions to that. Possibly 1984 by Orwell succeeds in doing that. But maybe even Gulliver's Travels. But yeah, okay. Otherwise, let's not get down that those rabbit holes. So anyway, his sister Margaret. Now, I think his sister Margaret was an Egyptologist, but all of them were very successful. So Fred's education began at Temple Grove School, followed by Marlborough College. Very nice place, Marlborough. I've never been to the school there, but I mean, I've been outside the school, and I like it as a place. Marlborough Downs, very nice part of the world. And he wrote his early bits and bobs that later became his novel David Blaze. And then he went on to King's College, Cambridge, where he became an active member of the Pitt Club. I don't know what the Pitt Club is. I'm guessing it's to do with politics, with the younger Pitt and all that kind of thing. Benson's literary career took off with the publication of sketches from Marlborough, and his first novel, Dodo, was released in 1893. Let's work out his age. He wasn't very old, he was in his 20s. 26. And he sequelized, that's a horrible word, he created sequels to Dodo, Dodo the Second and Dodo Wonders, which reflect the social milieu pre-World War Britain. Of course, he came from the kind of elite circles, and so he was uniquely, and if you notice in his stories, this one's different, but many of his stories, his humorous stories, Mapp and Lucia and things like that, satirize this country house weekend world where they all just go from cold and dusty country house to country house and don't actually have a job. But I think there was a lot more to him than that. he made fun of it, and he was most famous for Queen Lucia, Miss Mapp, and all of that social rivalries in the fictional town of Tilling, drawn from his experience in Rye, East Sussex. And we noted at the very introduction that he was mayor of Rye, lived in Lamb House, which had belonged to Henry James. Interesting house. Do you know, when I was down there last year, we were down in West Sussex. We didn't get as far over as Rye. It's such a long way, and it's difficult to get to from here. So Sheila's, funnily enough, going down to Lewis again this year, but I'm not. I'm looking after the dog. She's going to sound therapy thing. She's very into that, with her friend Siobhan, who's from Brighton, who is living in Costa Rica. So I think she's come back from Costa Rica. Anyway, they're doing this gathering of the ladies. This is actually relevant to something I'm going to mention. I think it's a woman's only thing. Anyway, and they'll be sisters together, and they'll invoke the earth energies, and this is like related to a theme of this story, really, in a funny way. I can usually relate most things to most things, because my mind sparks off like a spider's web, an electric spider's web. So anyway, so this is him. Of course, E.F. Benson is most famous to us as a writer of macabre tales, and some of these, don't criticise my use of the there in macabre, please. I'm sensitive about it. Macabre, I'll say, because I want to. And I say iron as well, because I want to. And anyway, call it an affectation if you want, I don't care. Where were we? So the bus conductor is one of his most famous ghost stories. I think his ghost stories are of a mixed bunch. Some are like The Lights, which is about Pictish people. I wasn't particularly impressed. How Fear Departed Along Gallery is really funny, and it's a satire of these poor aristocrats, falling on hard times. It's a bit like Cold Comfort Farm in some ways. Another great book. We won't go into that. Stella Gibbons. We won't go into that. And but I mean, Caterpillars I found quite disturbing, and there's a police thing in the background here. I actually don't believe they have that many emergencies. Honestly, don't. I think they just put it on when they want the tea, and they blue light themselves home, have a nice cup of tea with the missus, turn around, come back and arrest somebody for something. Anyway, this isn't to be a slur on the police, just an idle observation. And also, you may have heard during the story, the scrap man's been very busy this morning, dumping loads of iron, and I was trying to wait for him to finish, and I did wait in some periods, but I got bored of it, and I thought, I've got to finish this. Anyway, so you may know, whether it's relevant or not, that he was discreetly homosexual at a time when it meant you'd go to jail, or even had something horrible done to you, like Alan Turing in the 1950s, chemically castrated, grim. So anyway, there we are, that's E.F. Let's talk about this story, The Wishing Well, published in 1923. It was published in the collection Visible and Invisible by Hutchinson & Co. in 1923. And it's got a wide range of tales, and this isn't, I think I did Negotiam Perambulans, another of his stories set in Cornwall. So he has a number of stories set in Cornwall, which I like. Okay, liberty I took with it. I put a bit of Cornish in it. I don't know if you know, but I'm actually learning Cornish at the moment. And why not? Again, why not? I really like it. And so I had her speak, because they're in West Cornwall, so I thought, at that time, it's not inconceivable at this historic period that some of the old ladies would speak Cornish, and why not? And it's a fine language. I worried about I said something like, Grach nos os ta, so you are a night witch. Havel a war pobonen, like knows everyone, like everyone knows. Now, I had some problems thinking later on when I didn't. I thought, should I put Kepar a war pobonen? And I'm influenced by Welsh, because in Welsh that would be Gwrach nos wyt fel y gwir. You could say pobonen, pobyn, or pawb. So, yeah, anyway, I put it in, why not? I'm allowed to put bits in, I think, because it's my telling, so I can do it. And I do tend to try and characterise, and that's just the style I do. I think a lot of people like it, so some people don't have to listen. So anyway, let's talk about the craft of the story. So it's third person limited. That is to say, we're outside Judith, aren't we? We're not first person. We're not Judith, I saw this and I did that. And I think that's important because the problem with first person is you have to reveal everything to the reader, except if I think what's her name? Is it Gone Girl? Girl on the Train? One of those anyway, where she's that out of her head on drink. She actually doesn't know what's going on. On Memento, I don't know if you remember that film, where he doesn't know what's going on, so it's not in third person because it's very hard to do a film in first person. It's very hard to make a film in first person that you shoot it from behind their eyes. I saw one called The King of Cups about tarot that was like that. That was interesting. I like that one. Anyway, so it's third person but limited. That is to say, we have limited access to the thoughts and feelings of anybody else. We have access to Judith's thoughts and feelings. That's why it's not first person, but it's not omniscient. That is, you don't know everybody's. And older writers would hop around people's heads all the time. This is considered a cardinal sin in creative writing these days. If you're in somebody's head, you've got to stay in their head. You can switch first person viewpoints in serial, but you can't jump in one scene, which you'll find a lot of the old authors do. But that's very, very bad considered. It's just a fashion, you know. I'm being very iconoclastic because the rules that are doled out by creative writing teachers are just fashion. That's all, and it will change. Okay. Actually, he begins the story in quite a cinematic fashion. He's almost like we're zooming in. We're seeing the Cornish moorland. We're seeing the coast. We're seeing, and then when the focus shifts to this village, Saint-Gervais, it's remote, it's up on the moors, there's little tiny roads going there. Hardly anything comes and goes. We see occasional bus, we see hardly anybody waiting for it. And then he gets more into, we're not just, this is what we can't do with a camera, you'd need a narrative voice as well to be talking to you, but very distantly, very omnisciently, almost in some ways, telling the narrator's voice, telling us that, you know, actually Saint-Gervais is quite happy being cut off, and that's a big bit of foreshadowing, isn't it? This plays into the later tropes that would become folk horror. Now, folk horror has already happened by this time. It wasn't called that, but things like J. Sheridan Le Fanu's Laura Silverbell, Arthur Machen, all of these, they're very folk horror, and there's this idea of these remote settlements that keep themselves to themselves, but they harbour ancient knowledge that has descended down. This is a big deal at the time. I'm going to, in the piece I did about witches, I talk about Wicca and particularly Gardnerian Gerald Gardner's version of witchcraft, which he claimed he was initiated by an actually authentic coven in the New Forest. Now that may be bollocks. I think Ronald Hutton thinks it's bollocks, but I mean, he's far too elegant to say it in those terms. Maybe he would actually say it in those terms. If you ever listen, I don't know him, but I've seen a number of his talks and videos, so he might. It depends. I don't know. And anyway, so yeah, folk horror, remote, ancient beliefs, the wishing well, and then we kind of zoom in, and the first port of call is the vicar. It's the vicarage and the vicar, and we see this fantastic. You know, he would know all about rural clergymen, and, you know, they had a pretty easy life, many of them, and a lot of them were gentlemen. And I've talked about what gentlemen are before. They don't have to work for a living, but they'll get a stipend, and they'll get a nice house, vicarage, and they'd work on a Sunday, and usually they would go round the village, and if they were good, they would be with the dead and the dying and the births, and actually being like a therapist and a social worker, and a moral guide to the flock, and that was their role. But of course, he is too intellectually abstracted in his work on witchcraft. And then we get Judith, and we get this description of she's tall, she's quite a powerful figure, she is attractive, and she knows she is, but there's a slight cast to her eye, and that is the first bit of foreshadowing, I think. The next bit of foreshadowing is more blatant. It's when she's getting dictations about, and the narrator doesn't foreshadow it, just plumps a bit of information on you. Yes, you really like the dark stuff. Yeah, we know people like that, don't we? And not me. And so, you know, there we are. That's it. And then we get the, again, traditional folk horror thing of the village and the bad witch and the good witch. There is some kind of juxtaposition there, or gwrthgyferbyniad, as we might say in Welsh, which doesn't mean juxtaposition, it means the opposition between Mrs. Penarth, who has the healing touch. She's a light witch, she's a white witch, and we have Sally. I went with a girl from Cornwall called Travail. She was a second name. They're all called something like that. Travail, etc. This one, Tremaine. Tremaine, meaning the village with the stone, or the farmstead with the stone. Anyway, I don't know why you need to know that. So, yeah, so there we are. So that's a bit of foreshadowing, but then we lose the oh yeah, the other nice bit of foreshadowing is we get this description of Judith's, and this, I think this is really well done by him. We have the description of the landscape, and the camera is focusing in, remember, and we see the Cornish landscape, and we see Saint Gervais, not Saint Gervais, Saint Gervais, and then we see the church and the vicarage, and then we see Judith, and it's a flow of description, and then we have, and it is the isolation of the place quite explicitly is the scene of her. She's not going to get married. She's past marriageable age. She's 40 years old, so she's like nearly 20 years older than Stephen, I think. And I don't know whether that would be frowned upon. Probably would be. So, and then we get the fact that so the description shows the isolation of the place, shows the isolation of Judith of a piece. They are closely related. So Judith, in a sense, stands for the village of Saint Gervais. She is the avatar of the village. She has dark secrets. She's isolated. She has no inclination to go anywhere else. She just wants to be back in the place. So, Judith is Saint Gervais in a sense. Saint Gervais. I can't stop saying it like that. Okay. And then we have the description of Stephen with the son in his tall, beautiful boy. He was 16. And she wonders idly what he'll have grown into and that's a foreshadowing. We know where this is going to go after that. We've read a lot of stories like this. We know where this is going to go. Now, we don't get, what's her name, Pascoe. What's she called? Bonnie Lal thing. And so, who's a good singer? Blaise Pascoe? No, I can't remember her name. Nancy. Good old Nance. It's a good old peasant name, isn't it? Oh, you be doing, Nance. And, the rival isn't apparent, and then she falls into this petty. So the first thing is she wants to hook the lad, and then she's scorned, and boof, she wants to do him down, and so she does. But and she seeks the empowerment by the spirit of the dark witch, and also Sally Tremaine is really closely associated with the dark wishing well. The wishing well has two sides. So the wishing well represents both the light witch, Mrs. Penarth, who heals. People go to the wishing well for healing drafts, but also the curse. And that's really interesting because, curse tablets were a thing, particularly in Roman times. And in Gaul, there are, I only know this, there's probably in other parts of the Roman world, but, they would write on pieces of lead who put curses and they would throw them in. I only know that because a number of them have been found in Gaulish. The same thing was done in Britannia and at the Roman baths at Aquasulis, which is Bath today. And okay, the people in Bath, the common people in Bath, don't say Bath because that trap Bath split is a southeastern dialect feature. So in the southwest they have this long Bath. I can't quite do it, but so. Right, in most of English, the vowel in man isn't. I say it like a northerner, like an Italian as well. I have a pure a, whereas in most American English, Australian English, Southern English, man, and when it's actually real drawn, it's cat, and it's almost an e. And I think in New Zealand it becomes an e, but in the southwest they have this ae vowel. So, but they lengthen it, so they don't make it bar, they make it bath. Yeah, okay. Thought that's where. Anyway, where were we? So yeah, I think it's a really interesting story. I mean, there's no point really going over. She gets so it's a morality tale as well. She gets a just reward and she falls down into this well, and the well, as I was saying, is dual. I did say something, and I got really interested in the portrayal of witches, and then when I got really into it, it was really, really long. So I'm not sure I've got time to talk about it, but I'm going to just kind of say about how obviously the portrayal of witches in fiction has changed. So we start off with Macbeth. Macbeth's witches, the three witches, important there's three, are supernatural fates, and you can see their linkage. They're portrayed as ugly, wicked old women, but you can see their connection with the Greek fates. I talked about this more in this piece of posted on Patreon, and also the Norns, the three women who weave your fate, and then we come to Macbeth. Then Goethe has in Faust Part 2 has the mothers, and this is this numinous, creative and destructive power of the feminine. I think creativity inevitably and understandably is associated with the feminine. Women create life in our species, and so they're that's a massively powerful and has such a pull on all human thinking, and rightly so, but also in some way the mother, the great mother, is associated with death as well, and the devouring. She devours her children as well. So she gives birth and she devours them. We see this in the fates and the norms, and we see this in the ambivalence of the witches. They cast fate. They are morally ambiguous. Benson splits them neatly into good and white hat and black hat witch, but I think, as we see in the well itself, it isn't quite as simple. It's commingled, and Judith herself is commingled. She starts off as basically a good girl, and we're rooting for her, aren't we? But she becomes this evil witch at the end, and yet all she wanted was what anybody wants, is to be loved. She's lived this abstracted male life, if you like. In books, she's always been connected to the feminine earth and the villages and life, and like her father, who's very left brain, she has been connected to the earth, and she, like the earth, is ambiguous rather than ambivalent. She's of two natures. She's both commingled evil and good. She just wants a boyfriend, really. And the younger woman steals the boyfriend from her, in a sense. Although, to be fair to him, he plays it particularly decently. He doesn't lead her on. He's a decent lad. But she is punished for her. She's actually punished not for wanting a boyfriend, but for, I think if she'd, just dressed up and put a bit of makeup on, that would have been acceptable. I don't know if that's how you get boyfriends. Okay, I'm out of my comfort zone here. But I think it is, though. We could have forgiven her for that, but we can't forgive her for meddling with the supernatural. This is it's interesting that most religions advise you not to meddle with the occult, and I think what that's about is taking God's powers in our own hands, whoever your God is. Those powers of fate and what the future will hold, what the future holds. The future is empty and is to be created, and we can have a little part in that by gardening or writing poetry or narrating stories. But to try to usurp God's power, isn't it? It's try to be as I don't need God, I've got magic, And of course science and magic are closely related, I've said elsewhere. And again, that's another rabbit hole. So there's a million things to discuss here, but I think if we just focus on Benson himself, it's a really good story. It does have a lot of symbolism in it. And as I say, I'm not sure the authors ever know exactly what symbolism is in the stories, because they don't really create it. I mean, I think it's a conceit to think, yes, they write it, yes, they use their left brain to shape it and make it kind of digestible, but the content of the story is primarily beyond their control, as with all art, really, and that is divine, if you like. So what by their fruit shall you know them. I know it wasn't quite meant in that context, but it's almost like what we create, we then look at what we create, and we can then try and understand what we've done, but we in doing it, we didn't know what we were doing, and I think that's really valid. When I was studying English at school, so I was a cocky young lad, I got thrown out of lots of things. I was put in detention all the time, only through fun. I was just full of fun, as Tom and Charlie are in Ashridge, and he's in Ashridge himself. And I used to think I was so funny, I remember saying about Chaucer, saying, yeah, but he couldn't spell, miss, could he? I know he's a great poet, eh, miss, but he couldn't spell, could he? I thought that was hilarious. She didn't get the joke. She went, it's Middle English, Tony. And then, of course, the other thing was, I would argue with Jackie Lumby, who was my English teacher, who I fell in love with. Very, well, still embarrassed about it, and blushing now. I remember talking about. Actually, my English teacher was called. I had another English teacher called Alistair Brown, who I borrowed and put in Ashridge. He wasn't like that completely. He was a bit like that, but he wasn't completely like that. Anyway, going back to Jackie Lumby, arguing with her about how could a story ever have a meaning other than the author explicitly intended, and now I'm eating my words, aren't I? I was very cocky, and I thought I knew a lot of things, and I didn't. So anyway, a fantastic story. So the craft is really interesting. We talked about that. I think that was useful. The bouncing around, looking at the role of the divine feminine as the witch, and then of course there's lots to say about teen witches and Wicca and folk horror witches, and I write all of that in this essay, and essay piece that I put on. And you may feel it doesn't actually do enough to look to bottom out each one of them, but anyway, there we are. That's my mind. I can't help it. It's just the way it is. It's like saying, well, my eyes are brown. There we are. This is the way it is. People like it if they don't like it. I hope you enjoyed the story. I did. I think he's great. He's probably my fave, as I said. The Lady and Death, a companion piece to Durer's Print by Vernon Lee. 1. Since the portrait of my ancestress Agnes seems to have struck you, said Dr. Conrad Weber, and since even more you seem to feel that our little town is still warm and living with the past, I think I will tell you a very curious legend existing in our family, and of which Agnes Weberin, whom we call, after the Latin distich in her picture, Agnes Alcestis, is the heroine. But before beginning, I had better show you the effigy of the other chief persons in the story. He had been taking me the round along the wooden causeway still intact of the towers and gatehouses which gave that little town of Erlach, high above its narrow valley, the air of a great city, say Jerusalem, in one of Durer's backgrounds. And we were walking now in the wide principal street, the Herrengasse, planted with sweet-smelling lime trees and set with big gabled houses, all with trim flowers behind their window gratings. The street is closed not by any buildings, nor even by the city walls, but by a glimpse of country opposite, of steep green pasture and distant compact fir woods. And against this view, as against a piece of blue-green tapestry, there stands a fountain surrounded by a statue. The fountain is of a pattern common in southern Germany and Switzerland, and not without a pleasant reminiscence of the original village drinking trough of rough-hewn fir trunks, an octagonal basin like a tub, and rising in its middle a pillar with iron spouts spurting 4 thin rills of water. But on the top of the pillar is a statue, a knight in armour, leaning on his lance. The fountain, said the doctor, was restored, as the inscription tells us, by Berthold Weber in 1545, the husband of Agnes, surnamed Alcestis. But the statue is, as you see, considerably earlier, and belongs to that interesting and insufficiently known school of Franconian stonemasons who have left so many fine effigies of knights in our churches. It represents not St. George, you see the dragon is missing, but St. Theodulus, a holy warrior whom you have probably never heard of. Do you know, I answered, it happens by one of those coincidences which are perpetually surprising us, that I have heard of St. Theodulus, and not a month ago, and that now you remind me of him, I am extremely interested in his legend. His legend? Why, that was what I intended, so to speak, telling you, replied the doctor. Pray tell me first how much you already know about St. Theodulus. Has this to do with Agnes Alcestis, I asked, for I did not want to lose her story. It has everything to do with her. I can tell you what St. Theodulus is reported to have done here in Erlach, but you shall tell me what he did elsewhere, for we are badly off for saints' biographies in this Lutheran town. Well, I replied, I can tell you only this much, that a few weeks ago, as I was taking a walk in one of the Tyrolese valleys, not far from the source of the Isar, I found, near some remote cottages, in a runnel of snow water spurting across the path, one of those little water wheels which the children make in those parts of the world. Only in this case the toy consisted not of a hammer merely hammering on an empty preserve can, but of two little wooden dolls, who, as the water turned the wheel, thumped unceasingly upon each other. The thing rather fascinated me, and on closer examination I found that one of the figures had horns, while the other, with a sort of helmet carved on its head, was brandishing a wooden cross. A little girl came out of one of the chalets, and, seeing me in contemplation of the toy, told me her big brother had made it, and that it represented St. Theodulus fighting with the devil. That was all the information to be extracted on the subject, but I often think of the two wooden mannequins in the brook, and wonder how long they will go on hammering, without a pause, on each other, through fine weather and snowstorm. I was looking at the fountain while speaking, and for a moment the dark green alpine valley, its white glacier stream and meadows painted blue with crow's bill, rose up in my mind and made a background, instead of that medieval street, for the statue of the saint. The weather had given him the look of being made of rusty iron, and on his hip swung a real iron sword, and an iron pennon creaked like a weather vane from his lance. He reminded me of the metal knights at Innsbruck round Maximilian's tomb, but less barbaric and finer. The armour was rendered with every detail of strap and buckle, but the beardless face, surrounded by a nest or nimbus of wiry hair, was of archaic rigidity. Yet, doll-like though he was, it had an amount of expression, a tense, worn, pathetic resoluteness. What you say interests me very much, answered the doctor, his eye following mine along the fountain, and I am rather struck by what you say about the saint and the devil going on thumping one another day and night for ever and ever. That is the characteristic of all mythology. The saints or gods or whatever they are never leave off from their especial act, however unnoticed in the imagination of the people. It must have been the case with St. Theodulus. And the question arises, was the legend which you met in that Catholic Tyrolese valley an outcome of the story which purports really to have taken place in Protestant times in this Lutheran town of Erlach, but arranged to suit the requirements of Catholicism? And the question arises, was the legend which you met in that Catholic Tyrolese valley an outcome of the story which purports really to have taken place in Protestant times in this Lutheran town of Erlach, but arranged to suit the requirements of Catholicism? Or was our Erlach story merely an adaptation, connected with real dates and persons, of an old Catholic legend which Protestantism could not destroy? I felt bound to protest. "Upon my word," I said, "you are too much of a German, dear Dr. Weber. Here am I waiting to be told the story of one of your own ancestors, and instead of telling it me, you launch out into scientific speculations about its mythological aspect." The doctor smiled. "Perhaps you're right," he answered, "and I will do my best to tell you the story like a real story, the more so that I believe it is a true one. Well, to begin, but first let me draw your attention to the carvings on the base of the column and on the slabs of the fountain. They have to do with the business. I had noticed them already. Like the rest of the fountain, they were imitation Italian of the 16th century. They represented cupids, but cupids holding trophies of death's head and crossbones. When you have told me the story," I said, "I shall ask you to give the rein to your scientific interests. and to tell me the reason why throughout all your German art of the Renaissance, from Dürer to Holbein to the smallest little master, there is always death skulking round the corner. Ah, you've noticed that, replied Dr. Weber, the skeleton grinning behind the door, or looking down from the tree, or putting his hand in the peddler's pack, or waving his hourglass at the lady and her gallant. Everywhere death. Herr Tod, as he is called in the ballad I shall tell you part of. My story bears precisely on that point. By the way, can you see in your mind's eye Dürer's print of The Night and Death? 2. My ancestor Berthold, began Dr. Weber as we sat after early dinner in the little steep garden behind his ancestral house, was the most remarkable physician of a family in which, as you know, we have practiced medicine from father to son for 400 years. And I think I may say, judging by contemporary accounts and his books and manuscripts, one of the most remarkable philosophers of his day, the forerunner of the chemists and anatomists of the 17th century. He had been born in 1480 of Konrad Weber and Barbara Perlacherin, and returned to his native town of Erlach about 1525, after years of study and travel in Italy and the East. Returned not without a pretty bad reputation already for illicit knowledge. You must not imagine that Erlach, even in its greatest days, was a busy trading or manufacturing town like Nuremberg or Basel. It took its political importance from being on the crossroads from North Germany to Switzerland and from Frankfurt to Italy. But it was then, as now, an agricultural centre, and our forebears, burghers or knights, were merely the farmers of the neighbouring fertile districts, able to store forage and grain on their impregnable hillside, and thus to victual or to starve contending potentates. Such being the case, they were not accustomed to science and philosophy, and the fact of their having followed the Lutheran movement had merely given them a narrow-minded pietism, so that Berthold Weber, a Catholic, but of the slack pattern of the wicked Italians, a friend of Erasmus, a hanger-on of godless worldly prelates, a philosopher, and a man who openly declared that diseases were not sent by heaven, Dr. Berthold, I say, was not looked on with favour, and the rumour of the strange laboratory he fitted up in his house, of the queer animals he kept, the bones and skeletons he collected, and, they said, even bought at the gallows under Ravenstone, did not improve his reputation. So that, although he was not openly molested, people fought shy of him, and the celebrated Dr. Stumpfius, in a sermon at the Wolfgangkirche, even went the length of blaming his eminent fellow citizen, Councillor Heinrich Stoss, for giving his daughter Agnes in marriage to what he called a noted follower of Epicurus. This Agnes, the little maid Agnes of the Stosses, was the one whose portrait you have seen, with the Latin distich comparing her to Alcestis, and I suspect that the choice of the elderly and not very well-famed Dr. Berthold was an only child's wilful decision, reluctantly given into by her doting father. But, for all the preacher's insinuations, it was impossible for the burghers of Erlach to fall upon or exile so quiet and harmless a person as my learned ancestor, or one so often visited and sent for by the greatest princes. Moreover, it was certain that when the plague came to Franconia in 1525 and decimated all the neighbouring towns and villages, the city of Erlach was wonderfully little visited by the scourge, and many of those sick of plague were saved, owing, ostensibly at least, to the precautions taught the citizens by Berthold Weber and the newfangled remedies which he applied. But of course, although this debt of gratitude made it impossible to molest the doctor's person, the sense of it only increased the existing badness of his reputation. For it began to be whispered at every fountain and washing trough, and hinted more openly in every wine cellar frequented by the theologians and the more zealous burghers, that if Berthold Weber had succeeded in stemming the tide of the plague and saving his countrymen's lives, this was owing not really to his nefarious learning, but to a compact he had made with the Prince of Terrors in person, promising his own life in return for those of his fellow citizens, out of sinful curiosity and carnful vaingloriousness. Just the sort of disgraceful rubbish which our forefathers were always banding about, eh? I quite agree. But was the accusation false? There, my dear friend, I confess I do not feel so sure. People's contemporaries often accuse them of things they haven't done, but not so often of things which they themselves don't think quite possible in others. Among all the 1,000 witches who were burnt in Germany, a fair proportion in our town of Erlach, and the papers of the trial still exist. I don't suppose there were 10 who didn't believe in witchcraft, and a large proportion had been to the Brocken Sabbath, or thought they had. Apply this to the case of Dr. Berthold Weber. Nonsense, you'll exclaim. A learned man, a physician, a discoverer who forestalled Leeuwenhoek and Haller. But in those days of Paracelsus and Cardan, one could be all that much and yet believe in things which every modern schoolchild laughs at. For science consists merely in fitting a few facts which we discover or guess at into a scheme given ready-made by tradition and by fancy, and this scheme varies perpetually. Ours today is full of unintelligible things called laws and forces and so forth. Theirs, in the days of Berthold Weber, had other paraphernalia, more picturesque and perhaps, after all, as reasonable. Essences, virtues, almost human in shape, spirits like those invoked by Faust and drawn by Dürer in his Melancholia, bogies like the ones of Wohlgemuth and Kranach. Let us suppose that our ingenious and learned contemporary Dr. Weissmann had been brought up to think of heredity, evolution, etc., etc., not as laws, but as real entities, sorting the world's affairs from thrones up in the Empyrean. Supposing Dr. Weissmann to think this, would he not be acting like a genuine man of science if he took the necessary steps to meet, let us say, the Lady Panixia, attired like a muse or sibyl, with attributes and fluttering ribbons, and ask her, face to face, the true history of her relations with the spirit of natural selection, her honoured parent? You laugh! You laugh because, allow me to say so, you are a mere writer and believe in science with a big S, as something infallible and unchanging. We, men of science, are more humble and therefore more appreciative of our forerunners, and know that we should have thought exactly as they did. Dr. Weissmann, had he lived in the 16th century, would have acted, well, like my ancestor Berthold. And my ancestor Berthold acted like a genuine man of science when, thirsting to know the secrets of death, he applied for information at headquarters, went to learn the how and why of disease and dissolution from Herr Tod himself. Learn from death himself. You think that, perhaps, is a metaphor. It is a very fine one, and like the finest metaphors, it is fine because it is literal. Learn from death, not merely by standing by the bed of dying people and cutting up their bodies when once dead. No, my dear friend, but by going down to the Todesstall, to Death's Valley, and making a tryst, a compact with the skeleton hair in person, as the burgesses and theologians of Erlach, on the evidence of a certain woodcutter, asserted Berthold Weber to have done at the time of the Black Death. 3. I believe he did it, continued Dr. Weber, as we were walking up and down the narrow garden closed on all sides by gabled burghers' houses, by high-roofed barns smelling deliciously of hay and cattle, and where, on the open side, framed by great walnut trees, the valley slanted sheer, with another piece of old city walls and towers across it. I believe he did it because I believe she did it. But come and see her once more. Her portrait was hanging on the wide wooden staircase which led up out of the big entrance hall where the swallows nested above the doctor's dog-cart and the children's latest withered Christmas tree, surrounded by the portraits of bearded worthies in ruffs and wigged worthies in bands, surrounded also by quaint mottos in praise of God, of wine, and of song, painted in red Gothic letters along the walls. The portrait was by some humble imitator of Holbein, and poor though it was, it had a rigid, delicate line, and pale, pure distinction of feature, unmarred by shadows, which suited the lady's person and history. She had the beauty so rare among the women which that school painted, but which, when it exists, no other school renders like that one. A beauty of extreme rareness, eminently exceptional, and with its thin and perfect features and noble bearing, more than patrician, queenly. She was represented in a stiff bodice grown black with time, and just faintly showing a mixture of gold thread and gold loops, the pale hair hardly visible under the big white wing-like cap. A flower, something of the kind of the hyacinth, in the long, thin hand. She was no longer young, yet you could hardly say that she was old, emaciated not by years, but by some tragedy inherent in her noble brows and delicate loving mouth, and great eyes looking from deep vaulted sockets far into the world, a world of mystery and pity. Is your ancestress, Frau Agnes Weber, daughter of Heinrich Stoss and wife to Berthold Weber, is your ancestress really all she strikes me? I asked the doctor. Or has my fancy already taken the cue from the thing you have hinted at, and from that Latin distich comparing her for piety and fortitude to the queen of Greek Admetos, whom of the poets write? She certainly looks as if she might be some medieval Alcestis years after her stay in the kingdom of Hades, but with the remembrance of it always in her eyes. Agnes Alcestis, that is just it, answered the doctor reverently. Well, yes, I believe she did it. Historically, he went on, as we still stood on that landing, we know little about her. She came of a very old burgher family, the only child of Heinrich Stoss, who was town councillor and died a burgomaster of this town. There is an allusion to her, as I told you, in one of the famous Strumphius' letters, blaming Heinrich Stoss for giving his little maiden, only 18 years old, to Berthold Weber, a Catholic, though a noted follower of the atheist Epicurus, a man who under cover of medicine cultivates vain practices and impious notions, teaching that health and sickness are in man's hands, not God's. Moreover, as Dr. Strumphius, who perhaps had his own eye on this young heiress, tells us, a man no longer young, 20 years older than his bride, and taking advantage of the waywardness of a spoilt child's fancy and the ungodly weakness of a widowed father. A sort of Desdemona story. One might imagine the little maid Agnes falling in love with the learned elderly doctor for the sake of his wondrous learning, his strange accounts of travel and discovery, and his devotion to the poor sick folk. Be this as it may, we know that they were married in 1530 and came 3 years later to settle in this house, where Berthold died in January 1565, and Agnes 11 months later. Agnes bore Dr. Berthold 3 children, Werner, Barbara, and Ulrich, from which last we are descended. These 3 children all survived their parents. I want you to mark this fact, for it shows that Agnes Alcestis was saved one possible tragedy in her life. Neither does it appear from Berthold's carefully kept family records that any of these children was ever dangerously ill, and as we find them all married early and safely established as prosperous citizens, we may conclude that they did not give their parents unnecessary trouble by their conduct. On the other hand, neither the family records nor the city archives mention any loss of fortune or danger from fire, as was then so common, or destruction of property in warfare, so that on this score also Agnes Weberin was unusually fortunate. What circumstances, therefore, could have given rise to that comparison of the doctor's wife with Alcestis? What calamity could have left that look upon her face, in which, as you at once felt, there is the record of some great tragedy? Besides that Latin distich and the ballad I shall read you later, only one indication still remains, and that is even more mysterious. Here it is. Dr. Weber had taken me downstairs again and entered the long, narrow room which was his study, as it had been 350 years ago the study of his ancestor Berthold. He took from a shelf a great Latin Bible, printed at Mainz in the 15th century, and turned to the manuscript leaves of the back. Here, he said, are Berthold Weber's family records put down year by year with laconic accuracy. See? 1531, 3rd February, our little son Ulrich is born. 18th March, my dear wife Agnes goes to church the first time since childbirth. Deep snow on the ground, but nothing to repine at. Lausdale. July 1539. Our little daughter Barbara has measles, but by benign form and happily recovers. Lausdale. Then, October 1544, my wife Agnes and I decide upon restoring the fountain, much out of repair, of St. Theodulus from devotion to that saint, and ordering a painted window for our chapel in the Ulrichs church, showing the saint in question and ourselves kneeling in thanksgiving to God. Thanksgiving for what? For general prosperity and immunity from many evils? I scarcely think so. For immediately before this comes an enigmatic entry. Try and spell it out. I fancy the handwriting is very unsteady. August 1544. This month it has pleased the highest to search the heart and mind of Agnes, my wife, and myself, trying us both by different and unheard-of trials, and Agnes, my wife especially, as no woman of our times has ever been tried. Wherefore let us bear for ever a humble, contrite, and loving heart in dulci magno jubilo. That, said Dr. Weber, after replacing the sheet of tissue paper over the faded minute writing and putting the volume back upon its shelf, is the third of the only 3 remaining genuine records, the fountain of St. Theodulus, for the painted window was destroyed when Erlach was sacked by Wallenstein. This entry of Dr. Berthold's, the portrait of Agnes Alcestis, they none of them tell us the meaning of each other on their own, and none explain in the least why Agnes Weberin should have been compared to the Greek queen who went down to the kingdom of death to save the life of her husband Admetos. Mechanically, Dr. Weber had pushed open the study window, and we were in the garden once more, where the scent from the barns and the smell of the lime flowers filled the twilight. The explanation, he continued, is given by the legend, as we were all of us taught as children. As for the rest, every child in Erlach knows it, and as, until these cultured days, you could buy it in rough ballad form and print it on cartridge paper at every fair in Franconia. And that ballad is the story of Alcestis. Alcestis, the wife of Admetos, king of Perai, became Alcestis, wife of Berthold Weber, physician of Erlach. And Dr. Weber, walking up and down among the roses and stocks of his garden, the syringas and tall scarlet runners, suddenly stopped and looked full at me through his round spectacles. Agnes Stoss, he went on after a minute, a beautiful, imaginative and self-willed girl, marries the man whom she had made her ideal, and learns that the reality is more interesting, fuller and better even than the ideal, realizing in detail the life of devotion to truth, of tenderness to suffering of her husband. And Berthold, to whom the undreamed of happiness comes just at the age when happiness begins no longer to be expected, expands, grows young and human in her love. Then there are the children. Well, after some time of this, Agnes begins to notice a change come over her husband, a pervading, inscrutable sadness. He is, if anything, more restlessly active than before, spending days and nights in his laboratory, and he is, if possible, even more loving. But in his activity and in his love, there is something frightening. She feels it in the hurry, the effort, the passionate desire to consummate and to clutch of one who knows his days are numbered. But he will make no answer to her inquiries and denies any change in himself. Is he ill? Has he recognized in himself the germ of some fatal disease? That is how we moderns understand the situation. The learned man is able to calculate, perhaps to a month, the moment when his heart will wear out, or his brain give way. Or He has spent his life too freely while it belonged only to himself and to science. That is not the medieval notion, the notion of Agnes Alcestis, who, unable to penetrate her husband's secret, seeks, even like the queen of Admetos, for heavenly aid. The ballad tells us that she prays to Saint Theodulus, patron of those who suffer from cruel apprehension, and implores him to explain the riddle. In a vision, the riddle is explained. In the days of his loneliness, Dr. Berthold had promised to give himself over on a fixed date to King Death, in return for the secret of prolonging the life of the plague-stricken. And the date has approached. You remember Admetos in Euripides? Bertolt Weber is more of a king than he. Instead of bemoaning his fate, seeking a victim to replace him, he has kept his counsel and keeps it. Agnes never for a moment dreams of offering to die in his stead. The whole tragedy takes place unspoken. He, knowing his doom, thinks only how to hide the fearful fact to the last, how to make it fall as gently as possible on his wife. She, deciding at once to give her useless woman's life for the life of the man who can comfort and save so many others, lays her plans also in silence. It is the secret agony of these two souls, unable to seek for comfort in one another, which constitutes that unheard-of trial to which the entry in the family Bible is an allusion. And it is these days of unspoken reciprocal farewell which have left their trace, methinks, far more than the hours spent in Death's Valley on Agnes Weberin, making her Agnes Alcestis. It is strange to think, added Dr. Weber musingly, looking up at the steep gable of his ancestral house, at the whitewashed beamed wall festooned with vines, that it all took place here, within these walls, and sometimes I catch myself feeling as if I was seated in the castle of Lear or Elsinore, or in fact the palace of Pherai, where Heracles was a guest, and Apollo. Evening had come on. The upper sky, with swallows crossing and recrossing it, was turning greenish. The slopes and fir woods far off were veiling themselves as in thin crepe, and the high-pitched roofs, the towers and gable houses of the projecting part of Erlach, were profiled above the ravine like the twilit town in Dürer's print of St. Anthony. 4. Todestal, the Valley of Death. That also sounds merely an appropriate metaphor, said Dr. Weber, as he took me on a country walk the next morning. Well, it is not. It is a concrete reality. The Valley of Death lies northeast of Erlach, its opening where the Brook of Death, Todesbach, runs into the Erd, just a mile outside the Bamberg gate. I can show it you all on the ordnance map. And what is more, you are at present standing in the middle of it. He had led me across the high-lying cornfields and the thick fir woods, and then by a scrambling track along the rocks suddenly into a narrow valley. It was a corridor cut as with a knife out of the surrounding tableland, its steep walls of soft yellow stone, fringed at the top with trees and bushes, and barely wider than the shallow stream which stagnated in pools among its stones. In the rest of the world it was a sunny, breezy day, the green crops rustling like watered silk, but here there penetrated neither a ray of sun nor a breath of wind, and the great hemlock stood motionless amongst the oozy green stones of the sluggish, silent stream. After a few yards, the corridor widened into a kind of circular chamber, its floor of thick wet grass, its side more perpendicular still, with hardy little spruce firs and stunted pines striking their wedge-shaped roots into its top, and among them, high up like a hermitage in the Dürer print, was a tiny chapel with a wooden extinguisher roof. Dr. Weber sat down on the trunk of the old fir, which must have fallen ages ago over the wall of the valley. The little chapel, you see, he said, was served until the Reformation by a solitary friar, and to this fact we owe the knowledge that already in the early Middle Ages this valley took its name from death. There seems no reason why. The Bamberg Road, indeed, which leads to near its mouth, passes alongside of the Ravenstone, the place of the permanent gallows and the wheel, from which the ghosts of malefactors used to descend, even in my great-grandfather's time, and frighten belated travellers. But that is nearly a mile away, and couldn't account for the name of this valley. Perhaps indeed the name is merely a corruption of some word of wholly different meaning, but which changed in this way from a certain appropriate quality. Be this as it may, the Valley of Death, and more particularly this winding of it where we are seated, is the place of the last act of the story of Agnes Alcestis. I told you of the old ballad we used to buy at fairs. Listen to the beginning of it. It happened on a Sunday, in the pleasant month of August, since our Lord Jesus' incarnation for our sins, 1,000 years 544. The good folk of Erlach, with all the town guard with their pikes and crossbows, and all the guilds with banners, and many thousand men and women and children, all who could walk or ride or crawl, went forth outside the city walls to look down on the jousting in a certain valley. For you must know that in that place a trusty knight was going to challenge death in person, and force him to restore Frau Agnes, Berthold Weber's wife, who was willing to die in her husband's stead. And the town crier has summoned the good folk of Erlach from the tower top, and they have gone outside the town, men, women and children, many thousand, all who could walk or ride or crawl, to look down at the jousting in a Todesstad. That is how the ballad begins, went on Dr. Weber. Then the trusty knight bids the herald blow his trumpet, and 3 times the herald blows, and 3 times calls on death by name. Herr Tod! Herr Tod! Herr Tod! And summons him to give back Frau Agnes or meet the trusty knight in single combat. The 3rd time the herald also throws down the trusty knight's glove. Then Herr Tod appears, riding down the valley on a thin, pale horse. He has on a helmet wreathed with straw, and a gallant black sash embroidered with gold, but with no armour or other garments, for, says the ballad, he had on him no flesh to hurt, and in him had he no blood that could be spilt. The ballad does not mention it, but I imagine my poor ancestress kneeling close by, like the poor princess in the pictures of St. George. They spurred their horses on each other, and closed with a hideous shock. The lance of Herr Tod had struck in the pommel of the trusty knight, and very nearly thrown him off his horse. The trusty knight wheeled round his red roan horse, and rushed upon his adversary, but alas! His lance merely shivered against the iron ribs of Herr Tod's pale horse, and fell on the knight in splinters. But again the trusty knight wheeled round, letting go the reins on the neck of his red roan, and grasping his great sword with both hands. And as he came up with Herr Tod, who had also drawn, he let the great sword crash down on Herr Tod, and the skeleton, with dreadful screams as of vultures and a rattle of bones such as never was heard, fell backwards to the ground. Then the trusty knight took Frau Agnes behind him on his red roan horse, and carried her back to Erlach, all the inhabitants following, and the bells all ringing greeting, to where stood Berthold Weber with his 3 young children weeping on their doorstep. That is the end of the ballad, said Dr. Weber after a pause, rising from the tree trunk and preceding me along the narrow path and across the oozy stream. But there are 2 versions of it which differ in one important particular. The more recent version, written down when Erlach had turned completely Protestant and was smarting from its cruel treatment by Wallenstein, says that the trusty knight was one Dietrich von Krenglingen, whom the father of Agnes had hidden in his house during the persecution of the independent nobles by Kaiser Maximilian. But the earlier version of the ballad, dating from a time when Lutherans and Catholics still lived peaceably together in our town and were not very clearly distinguishable, tells us that the trusty knight was no other than Theodulus, the heavenly patron of the Webers, and who had descended from his fountain to defend them. It seems rather difficult to decide at this distance of time, and I think you may safely choose whichever of the 2 champions you prefer. At a sudden bend, we had come to the mouth of the narrow valley, and in front of us, where its perpendicular sides and fringe of birches and firs ended, there rose, high up against the sunny sky, the distant walls, the towers and high-pitched roofs of Erlach. As regards myself, said Dr. Weber meditatively, as I have learned from comparative mythology that nothing is more usual than to be two totally different persons at the same time, I am willing to accept both Dietrich von Kremlingen and Saint Theodulus as the Heracles who released from the bonds of death my ancestress Alcestis. So that was The Lady and Death, not Death and the Lady, by Vernon Lee. Vernon Lee was born in 1856 and died in 1935, just to give you some immediate context. Talking about the Dürer's etching, I've done a story about that. The dog in Dürer's etching by Argentinian, I think, Marco De Nevi. If you look him up on my channel, on the Ghost channel, you'll find him. It's a great story. You should listen to that one. I think, anyway, it's up to you. I'm not telling you what to do what you want. Anyway, so let's say a little bit about Vernon Lee. So, like many of these people, she wasn't really called Vernon Lee. She wasn't even a bloke. She was Violet Paget, born 14th of April 1956 in Boulogne-sur-Mer, in France, but her parents were British. So she was raised in a highly intellectual and cosmopolitan environment. She was fluent in multiple languages and travelled extensively across Europe, particularly in Italy. So I've done a couple of her stories before. I've done Oak of Oakhurst, which is set in Kent, which is a very English ghost story. Then I've done The Wicked Voice, which is set in Venice, which shows her knowledge of Italy. But clearly this one's set in German-speaking Switzerland. Interesting stuff, So her upbringing fostered a deep appreciation for history, art, and literature. So she was pretty famous in her time, but mainly for her supernatural stories. But she also wrote a lot of quite modernist literary criticism, travelogues, a lot of meditations about landscape, about classical themes. She was a very erudite woman. She was she dressed as a man, and she was openly lesbian, which was extraordinary in those times. She was a prolific writer, so she did the supernatural fiction, as I was saying, aesthetics, literary criticism, travel writing. Her first major publications, Studies of the 18th Century in Italy, published in 1880, was a groundbreaking study of Italian Rococo and early Romanticism. She herself was associated with the aesthetic movement. Now, some of you are just chuckling to yourself knowledgeably at this point because you've just accessed your knowledge of the aesthetic movement. Many other people, although they maybe would admit it, maybe they would. I'd like it if they would. I wasn't totally au fait with the aesthetic movement. You're going like, what's that? What's that? Let me tell you something about the aesthetic movement. So you can't talk about the aesthetic movement without talking about Walter Pater. Good old Walter. And he wrote a book called Studies in the History of the Renaissance, 1873. And so the important thing is he encourages people to pursue intense aesthetic experiences. This is the idea that the feeling quality that's obtained from art is the most important thing. So it was a cultural movement, aesthetic movement from the 1860s to the 1890s. Its key phrase is art for art's sake. 10cc added to that, money for God's sake. So you think about something like Ruskin. Now, I read Ruskin's biography last year and I quite enjoyed it. So Ruskin, John Ruskin that is to say, was a great and very important art critic. And he was born 1819, died 1900. He was not part of the aesthetic movement, but his ideas, particularly on Vernon Lee, Ruskin's ideas were really important because I remember she had this Italian focus, and he wrote Stones of Venice as well as many other things. And he was a great European traveller. So he believed, and he wrote things like The Stones of Venice, 1851 to 1853, Modern Painters, which was the work that really brought him to public notice. and he's championing of people like Turner in those days. And later the Pre-Raphaelite, he was a big supporter of the Pre-Raphaelites who are associated with the aesthetic movement. But why wasn't Ruskin an aesthete? Well, he was an aesthete, but why wasn't he considered a member of the aesthetic movement? Because Ruskin had a really strong belief that art was had a moral purpose to make society better, to make people better and society better. Whereas the aesthetic movement, and later you can see this going into decadence and things like that, it was art for art's sake. It was for the vibe, but it wasn't there was no morality to it. I mean, individual members will have had different views on that. So, but Ruskin promotes the Pre-Raphaelites, and the Pre-Raphaelites can be seen as a bridge to aestheticism, and then aesthetic movement becomes the decadent movement. I saw a fantastic exhibition on decadence in Vienna some years ago now, in the Schönbrunn Palace. It was fantastic, and I'm not a decadent, to be honest. But people like Oscar Wilde and Aubrey Beardsley towards the end of the 19th century, looking at art for art's sake, but embracing sensuality. Absolutely, that's part of it. But also kind of beauty for its own sake, and an element of potentially of debauchery. Certainly, they were seen that way, and maybe they were that way. I mean, I think if you read Dorian Gray, which I've done a version of on the channel, you see that it is a moral tale really as well. So I don't think it's fair to say that Oscar Wilde was amoral, although he was certainly viewed that way, of course, wasn't he? So we've moved a little bit from Vernon Lee, but it's just to say about she had a part of the aesthetic movement, because remember it's all about sensual vibes, but she was an intellectual, so she brings a more intellectual and psychological depth to its ideas, and she engages with music, psychological aesthetics, historicism, and what they say is Vernon Lee is important. I said she wasn't just a ghost story writer, because she provides this bridge between 19th century aesthetic philosophy, which we just talked about very briefly, and the kind of 20th century psychological approaches to art. So she's living at the same time, sort of as Sigmund Freud. She's around the same age as him as well, off the top of my head. Yeah, I think she is. She about is. And later on, the early 20th century becomes obsessed with psychoanalytical understandings of art. Hang on, the dog's food's ready. It's weird. We buy them raw food, raw feeding, then we cook it, because they wouldn't eat it at all when it was raw. So we're trying to get them to have it rare. So anyway, that's by the by. It's got to do with Vernon Lee. So Vernon Lee was a brainy, wasn't she? She was a brainy. Now, we talked about how she's part of this aesthetic movement which verges towards the decadence, and it's all about these strong emotional charges. And her ghost stories are often explore themes of decadence, obsession, and the uncanny. So certainly, The Wicked Voice and Oak of Oakhurst are obsessional stories, I think. This one isn't. This one's a neat little story. We'll talk more about the story in a minute. So she, as I said, she published studies of the 18th century in Italy, 1880, which was a look at Italian art. And then she becomes associated with the aesthetic movement, developing a keen interest in how art and beauty affect human emotions. But of course, you get back to Edmund Burke, going back to the a century before, and he writes this essay on the sublime, and the Gothic novelists jump on it because, and they say, people said their stories were trash, and they said, no, we're evoking the sublime. But if you like, and one way of looking at romanticism, which later sort of is related to his aestheticism. I'm not an art historian. I'm not in anything really, but I've forgotten what I was going to say. Just talk amongst yourselves for a bit. It'll come back to me. So, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so the Gothic is the kind of the sublime through the dark way, the left-hand path to darkness, whereas Romanticism is all about, daffodils I'm perhaps being a bit flippant there. I like a bit of romanticism, but it's to do with the light and the sublime and the beautiful and the wonderful, whereas the Gothic goes through darkness. And I think Vernon Lee approaches the sublime through the dark in many ways, through these ideas of the uncanny, of obsession, of decadence. Now, I think it's really interesting to compare her, and I may compare her a bit more with somebody like M.R. James, who was, I think, 8 years younger than her. They died within a year of each other, though. The other thing is to say about her, you may getting a picture of the woman, that she was a radical thinker and an early feminist, challenging the gender norms of her time, both in her writing and personal life. She never married and had close emotional relationships with several women, including the artist Clementina Anstruther Thompson, with whom she collaborated on aesthetic studies. Throughout her life, she advocated for women's rights, education and intellectual independence. And she's kind of Vernon Lee, if you look on the internet now, you'll see there's a lot of people doing the PhDs on queerness of her work. So she's kind of caught the tide again. After death, she didn't plan to do it. She was an outspoken pacifist, particularly during World War I, which made her unpopular in certain literary and social circles. She published Satan the Waster in 1920, a vehement critique of war, in which she condemned militarism and nationalism as destructive forces. I'd avoid politics, but it's interesting how she's coming from a very liberal position, and certainly even up to the 1970s and 80s, the liberal position was no war, anti-war, and that seems to have flipped a little bit now. But anyway, boom, boom, not even just spluttering in your coffee, throwing your coffee cups, but never mind. So, I don't want to talk too much about that. Later life and legacy. She continued to write on aesthetics and philosophy, but gradually faded from literary prominence. She spent most of her life in Florence, and there's a big collection of her works in Florence. She died on the 13th of February 1935. And as I said, not just feminist literature as well, queer studies and supernatural fiction, and that nexus where they all and they do tend to be studied together. The Gothic was always transgressive. So if you look at Gothic studies, they tend to be very interested in these areas and this crossover. Let us talk a bit about this story. You know the story. It is quite a simple story, isn't it? It's mythic. And remember, if you look at her other work, she was very interested in classical myths. I remember reading a piece of hers before I knew who she was, and she does this description, I can't remember which it's in now, of this, as if we're in like the 1st century AD, and we're visiting a shrine to, I want to say Bacchus or Pan in the wild woods or in Italy, and it's just the feeling of the haunting of the place and the spirit of the place, and the numinosity of this shrine, which I think we overlook. I think I got an idea of that when I visited India and went, that sounds so stereotypical hippie, doesn't it? And yeah, man, and we went to these temples that were like really alive, and I thought this is what pre-Christian Europe would have been like. The polytheistic place where there was different saints, the saints later take on the role of the local gods in medieval Europe anyway. But and that's interesting for Theodulus, not Theodolite, he's a Theodulus, Saint Theodulus. So this feeling of numinosity of places and sacred sites and shrines and things like that, which we've lost a lot of now. It's interesting, this play between Protestantism and Catholicism, whereby we see, probably to its chagrin, we see Catholicism as being more of a preserver of this idea of veneration of saints and the sacred nature of certain places, shrines that you would go to them and you would feel, and you would have miracles happen in the place where the saint has appeared. You can see the direct line right through history, whereas Protestants tend to be associated with rationalism, and it's a gross simplification, but there we are. But I thought it was interesting she brought that split, that dichotomy up in the story. So Saint Theodulus is a real saint who is credited with, Greek name though, is credited with the Christianization of some of the cantons of Switzerland. So it was a local Swiss and South German saint, I believe. Not much is known. I didn't find anything to suggest that St. Theodulus was a knight, but of course the other thing that she's doing here, and she's a million times cleverer than me, so she knows Dura really well, and so she's playing with this the famous etching of Death and the Maiden. So there's this the devil, and there's a knight in this Dura's etching. Go and look for it. It's a woodcut, I think, and please don't correct me if I'm wrong. I might be wrong. And there's a dog in it. There's the devil in it. There's a knight on his horse. And so, Vernon Lee knows this backwards, forwards, sideways. She's utterly steeped in her art history, And I think this is how come Theodulus is portrayed as this Gothic German knight. The rest of it's a fantastically interesting story, even though it's a myth. So when you start getting into myths, you can dig and dig and dig and never get to the bottom, really. So the knight fights the devil and wins. Well, that's extraordinary, isn't it? What does that mean? So remember, this is a woman who's very interested in the psychological aspect of ghost stories as well. So I think this is meant, many times I think writers, things emerge in a writer's work that he or she hasn't intended, but I think she is too smart. I think she is too erudite, and she knows what she's saying. So this night is not a mistake, and it resonates with Dura's work. But this idea that human, so it's not the devil, it's death, which is this force. If you ever want to read a book, you want to read Carl Jung's, also Swiss, Carl Jung's book, Answer to Job, in a nutshell. You may disagree with this, but Jung's idea was that the God image in Judeo-Christianity has evolved, and so we have the quite tantrum-prone God of the Old Testament who'll turn you to a pinch of salt, and you basically better do what he says. And if you don't please him, he's going to slam you down, and you've got to keep to his rules or else. And this is seen, many Christians have been troubled by this, because in the New Testament we have the Prince of Peace, don't we? The personal relationship with the loving God. So how does that square with this tyrant, basically? And I'm looking at a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost here, where Satan actually comes out as a bit of a hero. And so, going back to Carl Jung in his book, An Answer to Job, says, Job, if you know the story, Job is a God-fearing, decent man. He does everything. He keeps by the rules, and the devil comes along. The devil works for God at this point. So there's not this manichaeistic black and white, goodies and baddies. The devil is he tests people for God. That's his job, which is submerged in modern Christianity. I think popular Christianity, I'm not a theologian either, but it seems to me that popular Christianity has, by and large, folk Christianity is manichaeistic. That is, it sees the world black and white, a battle between good and evil. Whereas, of course, Orthodox Christianity, not with a big O, although with a big O as well, they would say that, the devil is not equal to God in no sense. The devil is a creation within God's universe. He is utterly subservient to God. There can be no question of equivalence, But I think folk Christianity sees that anyway. Getting back to the devil, not the devil, death. And get back to Jung. So, in The Answer to Job, basically the devil tries Job to see whether his faith in God or his devotion to God will break. And it doesn't, no matter what horrible things are done to Job. And Jung's argument is that this represents God before that is not moral, and he's amoral, and he becomes moral until we get the New Testament God who suffers with us. we are creations and we suffer, and Jesus Christ suffers as much as we do, if not more, and that is the kind of redemption, isn't it? Yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. People have been talking about this for 2,000 years. So in this case, with that in mind, this knight, who is a human, defeats death, which is a massive victory. No humans really defeat death. And then we look at the symbolism of the wife. So there's this question about her being, she just married this old bloke to spite her dad. That's the first thing that's thrown at us. Then a bit later on, there's it's surfaced, isn't it, that it may be that she kind of out of devotion to this very learned, very kind man, because this man, although he's shunned by, she maybe felt a bit like this as well, that she was trying her best to do the right thing in the world, and other people who were a bit more narrow-minded would just be, not approving of her. I don't know if that's true, but it strikes me it possibly is true. And then, they don't like him because he's a bit weird, because he's a man who doesn't do what society says he should do. He does what his heart tells him is the right thing, to the extent that he has made a deal with death, that if death allows him to save all these innocent people, he's massively moral, isn't he? He's far more moral than death. Death is just only a transaction, then he can take him early. And then, so he's a sainted man, really, in many ways. And then his wife also becomes saintly. She is prepared to lay down her life in the stead of her husband's, because she talks about, and take this as tongue-in-cheek, this is a feminist writer, and she says her useless woman's life. It's not equivalent to this learned man's life. So it's actually it's better to spend her life as a sacrifice. But that is also massively moral as well, that this wife is prepared to do that. And in Extremis they ask for an intercession, and St. Theodulus comes and intercedes, and things are pretty cool. Now, the final thing I wanted to say about that story was the fact that Conrad, the descendant of Agnes and Mr. Weber, the original doctor, he says, there are two versions, a Protestant and a Catholic version. So one is the rationalist version, which is the Protestant version, which says, oh no, it was this German knight. It's not very rationalist to say he fought death, but it's better than the alternative. And the older, as he said, the older Catholic version is, I can't remember what it was, but the point being, that what is that about? And it makes me think of Ian McGilchrist then, and his right brain and left brain, and he talks about how the right brain is happy to live with paradox and contradiction, and have the opposites completely living, not in opposition. Another Jungian idea, but the rationalist brain, the left brain, needs to have everything cut and dried. And I wonder if it's not an allusion to the fact that we try to impose this rationalist view on the world, which isn't rationalist. We try to make the world conform to the way we think it ought to behave. It ought to be like this, and in a sense that's like trying to do deals with God, isn't it? God is not to be dealt with, but anyway, so look how much you can get out of a very simple seeming story. I think this story actually would repay your PhD if you want to go and do it. So the final thing I wanted to say, which came up in this, and I'm realising I'm running on, is to compare Vernon Lee with her contemporary M.R. James. So she comes out a decade before, really, and we talked about her influences, decadence, aesthetics, symbolism, also influenced by Henry James, as we say many times, William James's brother. So Henry James being, we've done Henry James, so we won't go into that. So he wrote psychological ghost stories, Turn of the Spirit, etc. M.R. James, Montague Rhodes, was a much more conservative, in all senses, politically, culturally figure. And he's talking about 19th century English folklore, very interested in the medieval world, not the classical world that Vernon Lee was interested in, although she's interested in the medieval world as well, and ecclesiastical history. So he's not massively interested in theology or philosophy. Shoot me down, but it isn't prevalent. It doesn't jump out of his work. But he's got a product which is more digestible. We still have BBC making adaptations of M.R. James's stories, not Vernon Lee's. So it says, and her prose is more complex, literary and aesthetic, and appeals more to the Henry James rather than those wanting the quick, ghostly thrill of M.R. James. Now, gender bias, you work with your notes. Male story writers like M.R. James, Alvin Blackwood, Arthur Machen were more widely recognised, while Lee's work dealing with art, femininity and ambiguous hauntings was not as well marketed. I think ambiguity in ghost stories became more important in the 20th century. People I can think of, Robert Aickman and people. And I've talked before about how the horror in M.R. James's work, it's not a cheap ghostly thrill. There's something deeply weird about his most horrifying stories. So what we would say, if we were to sum it up, we'd say Vernon Lee's ghost stories are intimate, aesthetic and psychological, rooted in the decadence and obsession of her characters, whereas M.R. James's ghost stories are external, cautionary and folk-like tale, warning against meddling with things best left undisturbed. This is a really interesting point, because here we are meddling with death in this story, whereas M.R. James is like, don't dig up that whistle, don't dig up that hill, leave it all alone. Whereas she's saying, no, take on these chthonic, or I'm throwing them all in today, numinous, chthonic, I'm throwing them all in today. I'll be saying squamous next. So there you go. So if we look at their backgrounds as well, so in terms of class, now you may be aware, if you're not British, particularly English, that the English are obsessed with social class. And there are lots of markers of class, but these two came from a similar social class. The difference is, so Vernon Lee is upper middle class, but raised in a cosmopolitan, bohemian, intellectual environment. She is your classic liberal, if you like. M.R. James is upper middle to upper class, deeply embedded in British academic and clerical traditions, your typical conservative in many ways. She was largely self-educated, raised by intellectual expatriate patients, informal classic and artistic education in Europe, and he was formally educated. When I say properly, I don't mean anything by that, other than it was done by the rules. So he went to Eton, King's College, Cambridge, steeped in formal classical, biblical, medieval scholarship. Her cultural influences are aestheticism, decadence, symbolism, European philosophy as opposed to Anglo-Saxon philosophy, informal classical and art, I've done that, romanticism, Walter Pater, Henry James, him, English antiquarian, medievalism, biblical studies, folklore, ghost story traditions from Dickens and Le Fanu. Also, he's pretty interested in demonology, I think. She lives this cosmopolitan life on the continent of Europe, mixing with artists who call themselves artists, where he lives his life pretty much in Cambridge or in Windsor for Eton. He did travel beyond Britain, but he was happy with his lot, now, also personal life. She is openly lesbian. By all accounts, best belief is he was closetedly, if that's the word, gay, so interesting. This is the difference. But I think your other PhD is a comparison of the stories of these two contemporaries, Vernon Lee and M.R. James, looking at their supernatural fiction and comparing, contrasting, particularly because their social class, with the provisos and caveats, blah blah blah, already mentioned, is very similar. They're not coming from a mill working background in Scunthorpe. There's only still wearing mills in Scunthorpe. Steel makers in Scunthorpe. They're in Scunny. They're coming from a pretty well-heeled position, both of them. They would probably sound very similar that great marker of English speech is accent. They probably sound very similar. I don't know if we have any recordings of them. I need to. Simon Roper's your man for that. And they're both gay. And although, that's like saying two men are similar because they both have brown hair. But, when you're struggling for points, you just make any points. But there we are. So, fascinating stuff. I really liked it. I need to get back to some pulp for the lovers of pulp. I need to throw some weird tales at you. But there we are. Okay, I should say, so if you notice something about the final thing I'm going to say is the sound quality in this is I used to use Adobe Audition, and the thing about Adobe was it was about £23 a month to subscribe. It's the pattern, isn't it? I hate it, like, but and the trick they had was you paid for a year. You paid every month, but you signed up to a year's contract. Okay, so and they auto renew. So you might say, with most people, you can switch off the auto renew, so it just comes in. No, you can't with Adobe. You cannot switch it off. The only way to switch off the auto renew is to cancel your subscription. So I thought, I contacted them. I said, look, I don't really like the auto renew. I may well continue, but I don't like auto renew because it just hits you, And there you are, and you're tied in for another year, and I don't like that. And they said, oh no, you have to cancel. I said, well, okay, cancel. You can hear me having a strop. And they said, okay, that'll be a cancellation fee of several £100. You what? You joking me? And they said, no, we're not joking you. So you couldn't cancel. You couldn't switch off auto renew without cancelling. If you cancelled, so my terror was, and it was a terror, was I would forget it, and then boom, there's my auto renew, and I go, no, I'm going to cancel, and I've got to pay the full year. So I didn't want to do it, which is a pity because it's a bit like cutting off my nose to spite my face, because it actually was pretty good. It met all my needs. So then I thought, well, what am I going to use? Well, I've got Reaper, which I quite like, but I thought, I'll tell you what I'll try is GarageBand, which is, I've got it on my Mac anyway, so why not? So I thought, but of course I now have to learn how to use it, and I haven't quite yet. So you may notice that the quality isn't as good. Also, the other thing was I decided to leave tiny mistakes in, because this kind of to differentiate myself from AI, which I've talked about elsewhere. I'm not going to go in again. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Nothing scares an atheist, or so they'd have you believe. For Hector Greatorex's intellect, charisma, and a complete lack of faith, a life lived to the fullest, freed from his vows and called by his friends the Bishop of Hell. This scandalous, defrocked clergyman can drink and debauch right to the end with no fear of the consequences. Will this Bishop of Hell cheat justice, or will something claim him? Join me, Tony Walker, flawed but human, on the Classic Ghost Stories podcast for Marjorie Bowen's The Bishop of Hell. The Bishop of Hell by Marjorie Bowen. The Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. King Lear. England, 1790. This is the most awful story that I know. I feel constrained to write down the facts as they ever abide with me, praying, as I do so, a merciful God to pardon my small share-bearing. God have mercy on us all. In the hope, vain though I feel it to be, that when I have written down this tale it may cease to haunt me, I here begin. It was 20 years ago, and never since, day nor night, have I had any respite from the thought of this story, through which you can hear the drums of hell beat loudly, and yet which has an awful beauty. God have mercy on us all. Hector Greatorix was my friend, yet to say friend is to profane a noble word. Rather, he was my counsellor, companion and prop in all things evil. His reputation was hideous, even among the rake-helly crowd who flattered and followed him. He went lengths from which others shrank. And his excesses, his impiety, his boldness terrified even those hardened in wicked ways. And what added a deeper edge of horror to his conduct was that he had been an ordained clergyman. Younger son of a younger son, his father had placed him in the church in the hope of rapid preferment, for the Greatrix were a highly placed family, and the great Earl of Culvers was the head of it. But the scandal of young Hector's life was such that even in those days he was unfrocked. His intimates in the clubs and gambling dens called him in bitter derision, Bishop of Hell. I write of the year 1770 when this tale begins. Hector Greatrix was then in the height of his fame and fashion. No one could deny him certain splendour. He was literally in physical height head and shoulders above his companions, and mentally also. His wit, his invention, his daring knew no bounds, but all these qualities were turned to evil. He was at this time about 30 years of age, of a magnificent figure, so graceful that his strength was hardly noticeable, tawny-haired and tawny-eyed, with features as yet unblemished from his debaucheries, the most elegant of hands and feet, the most exquisite taste in dress, and the most engaging of manners. There was not one honourable man nor respected woman among his acquaintances, and all his intimates were villains. I do not except myself. There was, however, one exception. Colonel Bulkley, his cousin on the female side, had helped him by his countenance and by money. Why, I never understood. Because William Bulkley was the most austere, upright, and punctilious of men, of great wealth, of exceptional position, and of the most distinguished career. I think now, as I thought then, that it was quite impossible for Colonel Bulkley to realise what Hector Greatrix really was, or the set to which he belonged. The villain could be most plausible, and his cousin must have believed him to be wild, unfortunate, and blamable, but in no way vile or dishonoured. In sum, Colonel Bulkley effectually played the mediator between Greatrix and the chief of the family, Lord Culvers, who, no anchorite himself, was not ill-disposed towards his handsome and seductive nephew. But then his lordship, who was much disabled by gout, seldom left Greatrix Park, and knew little of London society, so that he was by no means aware of his nephew's reputation. I, as one of the most reputable of his disreputable friends, being, as I can truly say, more wild and young and vicious, was chosen to go with Hector to Greatrix Park when the old Earl asked his company. And so I was able to see at close quarters how this charming knave pulled the wool over the eyes of his two kinsmen. The end of the comedy was an allowance for Greatrix, a handsome subsidy from the Earl, most generously supplemented by a few hundreds more from the wealth of Colonel Bulkley. Greatrix was to study the law and live in chambers suitable to his rank. He had no chance of accession to the family honours of the Earl, whose heir, a dull, sickly youth enough, had lately married a blooming young woman of a robust constitution, who provided him with a couple of boys. So Greatrix, thanks to Colonel Bulkley, had done better than the most sanguine might have hoped, and he seemed more moved thereby than I had thought possible. Bulkley has done me a good turn, he swore, and damn if I'll ever do him a bad one. As for his allowance and the study of the law, he laughed at these things. What he really valued was the countenance of these two great wealthy gentlemen. This visit will help my credit in London, he declared. It's good for a couple of years' debt. And what when 2 years are up and your credit and the patience of your relatives are alike exhausted? Who am I, smiled Greatrix, to think 2 years ahead? I think it was impossible for him to conceive of disaster or even common misfortune. His object gained, he was impatient to return to town. A woman with red hair was waiting for him. He had a curious and persistent passion for women with that bright shade of auburn like burnt gold. Colonel Bulkley pressed us to stay a night with him on our way to town, and Greatrix, with an inner curse, for he wanted to be free of this formal, austere man, consented with a winning courtesy. Moyle Place was in Kent, quite near London. a commodious and elegant residence presided over by Mrs. Bulkley, who was some several years younger than her husband. This type of woman was unknown to either Greatrix or myself. I have had no sisters and could not recall the character or the lineaments of my mother. Greatrix had 2 sisters, but they were town ladies of smirched reputation, and his mother had been a passionate, reckless, uncommon woman. To both of us, Mrs. Bulkley appeared flat, childish, almost imbecile, almost incredible. She had been married direct from a Clapham boarding school and had there received several tokens, as the doting husband let slip, for deportment and good conduct. It was June, and she wore a muslin gown with a wide blue silk sash and a wide straw hat tied under the chin with another ribbon of the same hue. She lisped a little, and her small face was clearly and definitely coloured like a china ornament. She was, in fact, like the puppets children dress up and play with. Then, when she had gone into the house and was pouring tea behind the bulky silver, pieces that looked larger than herself, she suddenly took off her hat and showed her head, overflowing with auburn curls, long, glossy, almost vermilion, yet soft and like burnt gold, all knotted up on the crown of her head. With this revelation of her hair you saw her beauty, the golden eyes with blonde lashes, the features of such an exquisite delicacy, the pearly shades on throat and neck, the delicious carmine of faint carnation. I didn't care to look at Greatrix, and yet I felt that I need not have suffered this embarrassment. Colonel Bulkley was the one man in the world for whom Greatrix had expressed any respect or consideration, and the lady obviously adored her husband. I was both amused and surprised to observe the manifestations of sentimental affection between them. There was one child, too, a little doll in white lace just out of the cradle. What fondness Colonel Bulkley could spare from his wife was devoted to the infant. I was cloyed and thankful when we had taken our seats for town. Greatrix, after the effort of the last few days, was in a surly mood. "I have never passed a couple of days so tiresome," he said. And I always minded to jeer at him when I could reply, "You've never seen a woman so beyond your reach, Hector. She never looked at you, I do believe." He laughed indifferently. "Alicia Bulkley is ready to the hand of any man who likes to reach out for her." What was yet good in me was shocked by this insult to our hostess. A woman who, commonplace and childish, perhaps, had yet seemed to me to convey a sweet purity, a gentle fidelity, and an adoring affection beyond all reproach. "She's in love with her husband," I declared. "The more reason she can be in love with another. 'Tis your passionately attached wives who fall the easiest victims. That little creature is amorous as a lovebird. Take Bulkley away for a month or so, and she'd flutter into any arms held out." "By God, Hector," I swore, "if you can't believe in any nobility or decency, don't defame these qualities. Your words stick in my throat. These people have exerted themselves in kindness towards you. Mrs. Bulkley's silly, maybe, but a gentlewoman deserving of respect." "Since when have you turned Puritan?" he asked coldly. I was not affected by his sneers. I felt a certain definite repulsion against him, and from that day I saw less of him and applied myself with some diligence to my studies. We each of us had rooms in paper buildings, and the more I heard of Hector Greatrix, the more I withdrew myself from his companionship. 2 of his boon fellows shot themselves. The daughter of his laundress was found hanged. A married woman of his acquaintance was taken out of a Hampstead pond one winter morning. His name was associated, secretly and somberly, with all these tragedies. Some rumours of these matters must have reached the Earl in his lofty retirement, for I heard from the associates of Greatrix, who still continued to be mine, that there had been a summons to Greatrix Park, quarrels, and the employment once more of Colonel Bulkley as mediator. I had seen little of the Bulkleys. Their severe and yet sentimental life, the chaste simplicity of their connubial bliss did not greatly attract me. I had been asked again to Moyle Place, and had needed all my fortitude to control my yawns. Mrs. Bulkley had now another infant at her breast, and was more than ever infatuated with her husband. Another 6 months, and this idyllic family was rudely disturbed. Colonel Bulkeley's regiment was ordered to India for 3 years, and he was forced to leave abruptly his wife and children he so tenderly loved. That winter, to my surprise, I met Mrs. Bulkeley in a London ballroom. It was only a few months since her husband had sailed, and I imagined her consoling herself with her babies at Moyle Place. When I spoke to her, she seemed shy and confused. I learned that she had moped in the country, that the doctor had ordered a change, and that these insufferable years of waiting would seem shorter amid the distractions of society. She was staying with a married brother at St. James's, and I couldn't doubt that she was well protected, both by her own heart, her position, her relatives, her children. Yet, when I saw her dancing with Hector Greatrix, I did not care to watch. Needless to follow the course of an experienced and heartless seducer, suffice it to say that Greatrix was soon talked of in connection with Mrs. Bulkeley, and, unattainable as I believed her to be, I could not forbear an appeal to her pursuer. I found him, by rare luck, in his chambers. "For God's sake, Hector," I conjured him, "stop your attentions to Mrs. Bulkeley. Even though it is impossible for you to destroy her peace of mind, you may blight her reputation." "What is this to me?" he asked coldly. "Did I not tell you she would come at my whistle?" I urged him to forbear. Never before had you compromised a woman of her position. Consider what it will mean to you, the fury of your uncle and of her husband, the scandal it will put you out of society, out of England. "And there," he interrupted, "I am likely to go in any case. I can keep the duns quiet no longer, and my lord will be bled no more." I told him I hoped he would go before Mrs. Bulkeley's good name was smirched by his detestable attentions, and I reminded him solemnly of his obligations towards Colonel Bulkeley. He had no answer for me, and soon after I observed with relief that Mr. Lambert, Alicia Bulkeley's brother, had taken alarm, and that she was being kept from any opportunity of meeting Greatrix. Yet what availed this? Hector Greatrix, having spun his credit to the utmost, and within a few hours of the Fleet prison for debt, fled to the continent, and Alicia Bulkeley went with him. Though I was never squeamish in these affairs, I will confess that this completely sickened me. The man was so vile, the woman so infantile, so pure, so attached to her husband. The scandal was hideous. The Earl cut Hector off with a curse. The Lamberts adopted the abandoned children, and as soon as they had news of Alicia, sent her a small allowance that was probably the main support of the wretched couple. This money was sent care of a bank in Genoa, but no one knew where Mrs. Bulkeley and her lover really were living. Through the compassion of His Royal Highness, who had the chief command in India, Colonel Bulkeley was allowed to return to England on the receipt of the awful news, and arrived in London something less than 2 years since he had sailed. He immediately resigned his commission and returned with his children to Moyle Place. Declaring that he had no intention of following the fugitives, he said simply that if Greatrix ever returned to England, one of the two would, in a few days, be dead, and Mr. Lambert, with his next remittance, reported this message, advising his unfortunate sister and her paramour to keep clear of their native country for fear of further scandal and horror. I avoided the possible chance of meeting Colonel Bulkeley. I had no desire to see this broken and outraged man, whose career that had promised so splendidly was broken in the middle, and for whom life seemed to hold nothing but bitterness and humiliation. This, it might seem, should be the end of the story. It indeed appeared that nothing further could happen, either to the outcasts in their exile or to the betrayed husband, to alter the position of either or in any way bring them together again. But who would have guessed at the turn fate had in store? Colonel Bulkeley had not been home much more than another 2 years when a severe epidemic of smallpox broke out in England. Among the first victims were the wife and children of Lord Culvers, the son by his first marriage, always delicate, had lately died of a decline, and the old Earl, then over 70 years of age, did not long endure the shock that sank under the weight of his bereavement a few days after the funeral of his youngest child.
The estates and the money were both entailed, every portion of property having been strictly tied up by a preceding earl, and Hector Greatrix was now Earl of Culvers and one of the wealthiest noblemen in England. Lord Culvers was summoned to London by his lawyers, and on the same day Colonel Bulkeley came up from Moyle Place and took a house in Dover Street, Mayfair, not far from his lordship's town mansion, Culver House. Hector came as far as Paris, and there stopped. He still had Mrs. Bulkeley with him, not, as I suppose, from any remnants of affection, but because of her allowance, which, till now, was his sole means of support. I winced to think what Alicia Bulkeley must be like now. There had never been any talk of a divorce, but now people began to ask why Colonel Bulkeley did not permit his wife to marry her lover. They were people who did not know Hector. I received, unexpectedly, a summons from my lord to attend him in Paris. He had not too many reputable acquaintances then, and I had become a respectable enough citizen while he was sliding down to pandemonium. Therefore, I supposed, this dubious honour. I went, as one will, partly out of curiosity, partly out of complacence, and partly out of a faint pity for Alicia Bulkeley. He had, of course, handled plenty of money already, and upset as the city still was, I found them elegantly installed in an hôtel meublé that had only lately become national property. Hector was sumptuous to behold, and cordial enough in his wild way. He had changed for the worse. The first bloom of his beauty had gone, the first fineness of his manners, but he was handsome enough. God help him. She was with him. I learnt afterwards that she had had and lost in the feverish heat of Italy 3 children, and never had she been without another woman sharing her lover's favours. Often these lived under the same roof with her. She had known, I think, most of the humiliations possible to a refined woman who lived with a vile, brutal man. There could have been little of horror and squalor that she hadn't seen, nay, been in the midst of. I could hardly keep curiosity from my eyes. This was the doll of Moyle Place, with her lisp, her muslin, her babies. She was, and this is perhaps the most horrible thing, much more beautiful, rich, opulent in line now, with a full bosom and flowing curves of thighs and shoulders. Taller she had been but 18, clever at dressing, clever of speech, gay, abandoned, and intolerably wretched. Her tone was one of bravado, but the look in her eyes was that of a whipped dog who creeps away from the lash. As soon as we were alone, she was down on her knees to me with a movement so passionately sudden that I could in no way prevent it. On her knees, Mrs. Bulkeley of Moyle Place. "Tell me," she implored, "will not William divorce me? Surely you have some message from him?" I told her none. She began to weep. "If I were free, Hector might marry me before he returned to England. That is my only hope." "Surely, madam," said I in pity, a vain one. But she was not yet free of the illusion women are so slow to lose, that they always have some power over a man who has once loved them or been their lover, and she cherished the desperate hope that her husband might set her free, and she regained something of all she had lost under the name of Lady Culvers. Never was there a more futile and piteous hope even in the brain of a foolish woman. I could not forbear saying to her, when I had induced her to rise from her knees, "Madam, has not your association with my lord shown you the manner of man he is?" "Indeed it has," she answered bitterly. "Yet surely he could not, in these changed circumstances, abandon me." So she clung to the protection of that honour she had herself discarded, and a panic terror showed in her eyes as she added that she had now nothing with which to keep him. It had always been the money that had held him, the money the Lamberts sent, and, heaven avert its face, other money, presents from Italian lovers of hers whom he had forced on her, she told me, with a wildness that made me fear for her reason, that she had paid for her last child's funeral by such means. "And yet, madam," I shuddered, "you wish to continue your association with such a monster. Indeed, I wonder that you have already not left him, if only for the protection of another man."
As she was silent, I added, "Is it possible that you love him?" She replied, "No, I have never loved any but William and my dear, dear children." But I doubt if she knew what love was, and I think that for months she had known no emotion, save fear. Seeking to abate her misery, I asked her what she could dread worse than what had yet befallen her. "There's hell," she said. "I should think," I replied, "that hell is where my Lord is." But no, to her, still at heart a religious, respectable English gentlewoman, anything was preferable to the life of open shame before her if my Lord forsook her. She thought, in her narrow, ignorant mind, that if she could marry her lover, her fault would be condoned, and I knew that in the eyes of many it would be. I advised her that she could go into retreat somewhere with the money that the Lamberts allowed her, but she shook her head with a feeble laugh. She knew, she said, with a dreadful accent, her own weakness, and she saw herself, once cast off by my lord, sinking to the lowest depths of degradation till she reached Bridewell or a foreign lazar house. And I could see this too. I promised to speak to my lord, but naturally with little hope. But the next day, when I saw him sitting over his breakfast playing with his dogs, he gave me no opening, for he plunged into his own affairs. "Looky here, Jack," he said, "I was too drunk yesterday to talk business, and when I came back from the opera and you had gone. But this is the matter I sent you for. Has Bulkley seen reason? As I've no news, I take it he's gone to his prayers and his pumpkins at Moyle Place, and will give no trouble." "No," I said. "Colonel Bulkley came up to London as soon as he heard of your fortune, and has taken lodgings in Dover Street. 'Tis said that he keeps a watch posted by Culver House for your return." My lord's face turned ashy. "What for?" he cried. "That he may challenge you the moment that you set foot in England." My lord sprang up then. His rage was diabolic. There's no other word for this fury of a fiend outwitted at last. His oaths and blasphemies were detestable, atrocious, as he strode up and down with his dressing gown flowing open and his locks damp from last night's debauch seeming to rise on his head. "I never heard," I said, wincing, "that you were a coward, Hector. But it seems you are." "Coward!" he yelled. "When I eloped with Bulkley's wife, I was a ruined man without a prospect in the world. Did I think I'd ever want to return to England with the title and money?" He had been, in fact, exquisitely caught, but I could feel no spark of compassion for him. "You'll have to meet the man," I told him, not looking at his distorted face. "I'll not. Bulkley's a damn good shot. Do you think I want to go it when I've suddenly got everything to my hand?" I could guess that he did not. To him, the position, the money, meant the opening of paradise. He would, no doubt, have a good life. Fine flatterers, fine women, all that wealth could buy in London would be his. Nay, there would be plenty who would receive him in the finest society of the town, and not scruple to offer him their daughters in honourable matrimony. The hounded exile would be the great lord, and at last able to get full value for his rank, his beauty, his audacity, his fascination. "I stay in Paris," he cried. "People will come over to me here. I'll cheat the man that way. Paris is as well as London, if you have money." "It were wiser, perhaps," I said with disgust, "but no one will endure a man who is an avowed coward, my lord. You'll have to keep the company you've been used to lately if you stay out of England. People will know why. They're beginning to say already that you linger. I, for one," and I rose, "will turn my back on you." "Blast your impudence, Jack," he whispered. "What is this tone to me?" "Your peer of England, Culvers is a great name. It'll cover much, but not cowardice." "Damn that word! I don't want to die. That's reasonable." "Yes, if I were you, my lord, I should not want to die." "Bah, you're thinking of my bishopric. Hell, as if I believed in hell. There's nothing, not even hell, Jack. One goes out like a snuffed candle. Just blackness, blackness, nothingness, nothingness." The look on his face as he said this was one of such awful despair that I thought this was a moment when he might be softened by his own terrors. "I can see one possible way out, Hector. If you were to let Colonel Bulkley know that if he divorced his wife you would marry her, perhaps for her sake, he would forego his revenge.
He laughed in my face. The woman's been the harlot of half the rogues in Italy. I stopped him. Don't talk of that. Even your corroded heart might blench there. Marry her if you can, for your soul's sake, and hers. His hideous pride was greater than his fear. A kept woman, he mocked, my God, I'm cultus now. Remember it, I recommended him. What do you mean to do with this poor creature? Then, as if he remembered that she was the original cause of his present predicament, he began to curse her, using those abominable names he so freely applied to women. And as for what he meant to do with her, his project was what the miserable wretch had herself guessed, complete abandonment, and his view of her future was her view, the streets and the Maison de Dieu. I reminded him of her birth and upbringing, of her relatives, but he only redoubled his blasphemies. Am I answerable if these Puritans breed women who run into the gutter? I left him, useless to contemplate a spectacle so frightful, and I avoided any further interview with Alicia Bulkley. When I returned to London, I observed the watcher set by Colonel Bulkley near the shuttered gloom of Culver House. In 3 months' time, my lord returned to London, whether urged thereto by the jeers of his enemies, the flatteries of his friends, or his own pride, or whether unable to endure his tantalus position, or whether his nerve broke at the suspense and the waiting. I know not, but he came to London. I had heard that he had hopes of approaching Bulkley with offers of apology or even money, of seeking in some way an accommodation. This sounded ridiculous, but from his nature it was possible to conclude that he cherished some such plan. He arrived in London secretly, with a horrid stealth, and slipped into Culver House under cover of a November evening. Yet, the next morning, Lord Mildmay called on him with a challenge from Colonel Bulkley. That same evening I was summoned to Culver House. My lord sat with some of his old boon companions in one of the dismantled rooms, for his coming had been sudden and unexpected. The holland covers were yet over the great velvet and gilt chairs, muslin bags enveloped the candelabra, and where the bottles and glasses stood on the ornate table were rings in the dust. Candles had been hastily stuck into tarnished sticks, and the only other servants were the French rascals my lord had brought with him. Rosy amorini and florid wreaths peeped from the shadows of the imposing walls, and the lordly pomp of this chill magnificence was a strange background for the men drinking by the huge fire on the marble hearth. Everyone was drunk but my lord, but he, this night, could find no oblivion in the wine-cup. Panic kept his head clear, and I could see by the ferocious anguish of his face that his thoughts were by no means dimmed. He met me with bravado. If I go to hell tomorrow, I'll pay you a visit to let you know what's like. Is Bulkley so infallible? Asked one of his followers, and another with tipsy malice. He's a damn good shot. He has on his side justice, at least, I said coldly, for I had now come to detest my lord. He looked at me in agony. Say I have a chance, he muttered, and I smiled, always having believed him to be of an invincible courage. For all that, I thought his chance good enough. If Bulkley was a fine marksman, so was my lord. Why don't you get to bed? What time is the meeting? I looked with contempt at his hideous company. Not one of them had set foot in Culver House, or any mansion like it before. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, said one, Hilton, the soberest of the wretched band, and my lord's second. It was now past midnight. Why have you sent for me? I asked again. He was pacing up and down the room in a very climax of terror and rage, while the drunken crew round the table condoled with it and mocked him in a breath. He wore an almond green velvet coat, overlaced, I recall, with silver, for that year the men's clothes began to be very plain, and his hair was long and powdered in the old-fashioned style still favoured in Italy. I think that the beauty of his lineaments rendered his expression the more awful, the despair, the dread, the fury expressed in that pale visage were awful indeed to contemplate. I will not go, he cried. I'll not stand up and be killed. He then asked me to make his will. I was by then a lawyer of some modest standing. for the Culver property was his to dispose of, since he was the last male of his family. Yet, when it came to asking his wishes, he would not reply, and finally refused to consider the matter, and so I left him, staring into the huge mirror with a glass of brandy in his hand, and cursing the clock for marking the passage of the time. I had not dared to ask him anything of Alicia Bulkley, but as I was leaving I did demand particulars of the lady from one of the servants, a man I had seen in Paris. She had been left in Paris, quieted, I gathered, by some lie as to my lord's return. This affair, and mainly the memory of my lord's face, so wrought on my mind that I could not sleep that night, and went out early for news of the duel. I got this from the creature Hilton, the second. The meeting had taken place in Hyde Park, and at the first shot my lord had fallen. "Killed?" asked Colonel Bulkley. "Sir," said the surgeon, bending over the writhing man, "death would have been more merciful. He is shot through the jaw." "He is marked where I aimed to mark him," replied the implacable soldier coldly. "He will never kiss another man's wife again, nor his own, nor even any drab from Whitefriars." With that remark he left the park. His austere figure and his sombre countenance had never changed during the course of the encounter. My lord was carried home in his carriage. He soon became unconscious, for the lower part of his face was shattered, half blown away, and though he might well live, he would never be anything but a mask of terror. Alicia Bulkley, quieted for the moment by my lord's lies, no sooner lost sight of him than she fell into a fierce panic and resolved to follow him by the next packet. With little more than the price of her journey in her pocket, and accompanied by a huge negress who was her last attendant, she landed at Dover 24 hours after my lord, and took the night coach to London. Arriving there, the demented creature could think of no asylum but Culver House, and as she could hardly believe that the man for whom she had sacrificed everything, and with whom she had lived for years, would refuse her shelter, she directed her steps to the stately mansion of my lord. The valet who opened to her knew her, and was for refusing admission, but the negress said cunningly, Mrs. Bulkley being past coherent speech, that my lord had sent for them, and the servant, not knowing if this might be so, reluctantly admitted them. The two shuddering and draggled women had just reached the great doors on the first landing when my lord came home. He had regained consciousness, and though his pain was fearful, he had no tongue to make lament with. He walked between Hilton and the surgeon, who were indeed not well able to carry so large a man, and so slowly came up the wide treads of the stair to where Mrs. Bulkley, who had heard the steps, cowered against the door, her silk shawl, her fallen hair, her bonnet disarranged, her face like milk, her lips ashy. As my lord came into view, with his jaw swathed in bloody bandages, and his terrible eyes above them, she broke into shriek after shriek. My lord sprang forward with a strength that made nothing of those who held him, took the frail wretch in his quivering hands, and hurled her down the stairs. The surgeon tried to catch her, but she was weak, and her high heel caught in her dress. She fell to the bottom of the flight, and lay in the hall. Whimpering, the negress scuttled after her. Hilton, to please his patron, from whom he still hoped favour, said, "It's Alicia Bulkley, the cause of the whole damned business. Turn her out," he added to the gibbering valet. The surgeon, who was a fashionable man and feed by my lord, made no protest, and as the earl was led to his chamber, the servant and the negress picked up Mrs. Bulkley and carried her into the street. She stirred as they touched her, and the black woman clamoured for pity, so that the valet consented to carry her to a pothouse nearby, where the landlady, after marking her rings and watch, took her in and let her lie in a back room, where the customers came and stared at her, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and beer. She asked for her husband and the clergyman, but the negress was too ignorant to know what she meant, and so, about noon, she died, aged not quite 23 years. It was a clear case of murder, but the landlady and her gossip, the slipper doctor, hushed the thing up, robbed her of her rings, watch, silk, and linen garments, and even the burnt gold hair that had first attracted my lord, and buried her in a pauper's grave. the negress. They turned into the street, and she, distracted with terror, crept back to Culver House and begged for scraps at the kitchen door. There, out of compassion, they gave her my name and where I was to be found, and I discovered her on my stairs when I came home that night, and so learnt from her the manner of Alicia Bulkeley's death. I sent the poor wretch to a friend who had a house of servants, and debated whether or not I should write these matters to Colonel Bulkeley. I was not encouraged to do so by the remembrance of his face on the morning of the duel, and while I hesitated, I had news of the death of my lord. This was practically suicide, because his life had never been in danger, but he tore off the bandages with a ruthless hand, turned his mutilated face to the wall, and furiously died, the day of the burial of Alicia Bulkeley. Would that this were the end, and that I, who believed in neither heaven nor hell, could have here finished with Hector Greatrix, 7th Earl of Culvers. I went out that day to a gathering of people who knew nothing of my lord, and stayed late, endeavouring to forget. I drank and danced and gambled, and fled the gossips who must mouth over the Culvers scandal. When I returned, I found that the light on the stairs, commonly left there by my laundress, had gone out, so must fumble my way up in the dark and silence of the quiet building. When I reached my room, I must fumble again in the dark for flint and tinder, feeling from one piece of furniture to another. It was cold, and through the tall window I could see the moon like an icicle in the dark sky. At last, when I had begun to be considerably oppressed by the dark, I found the tinder box and struck a light. As I set the flaming tinder to the candle, I perceived that I was not alone in the room. Someone was seated in the hooded chair that had its back towards me. A man. I could see the white hand hanging down, the skirt of a coat on which some bullion trimming gleamed. I concluded the friend, minded to pay me a visit, had gone to sleep, awaiting my return. I approached, holding my light, and with I know not what feeling of unfathomable dread. The figure turned as I neared. It was my lord. He wore the almond green suit with the silver braiding in which I had already seen him hold his ghastly vigil of terror and fury. God have mercy on us all. His face was alight. Where the visage should have been was a ripple of flames quivering upwards, and through this crimson veil of fire gleamed his infernal eyes with an expression of unutterable woe. The flames rose above his head, shaped into a peak. He wore a shining mitre glittering with lambent fires of green and blue, like hellish jewels. This fiend had been forced to keep his oath, to discover to another scoffer the truth of hell. My eyes could not long support this atrocious spectacle. As he raised his ashy hand in mock benediction, I fell senseless, seeing as I dropped the demoniacal mitre flare from his flaming brows to a man's height above his tortured eyes. So, that was The Bishop of Hell by Marjorie Bowen. Came out in 1949. So Marjorie Bowen, the first thing I've got to tell you is, wasn't her real name. I always say it's always bad to start a relationship with a lie, but that's what she's done to us, because her real name was Margaret Gabrielle Vere Long. She was born 1885, died in 1952, and she wrote works under the pseudonyms, lots of pseudonyms, Marjorie Bowen, Robert Pay, George P. Preedy, Joseph Shearing, and John Winch. Where did she get them from? I mean, it's a phone book probably. She was prolific, and she wrote over 150 books, many achieving bestseller status in both the UK and the US. And she wrote authentic, although rather melodramatic, historical novels. You can see that, can't you? With The Viper of Milan was her first book, written in 1906, when she was just 16. She wrote that. It was initially
dismissed by publishers because they felt young ladies shouldn't be writing about such things as vipers in Milan. I mean, for me, I would have thought it was some kind of treatise on natural history, you know, reptiles of Italy. Maybe she called it that. She would have got it published. But it was a little bit, I think they used to call them, or there was a phrase later on, not early in 1960, called bodice rippers, wasn't there? Anyway, and I didn't find this particular story salacious. I think they became more so, not hers, but you know, the genre of historical novels about wealthy ladies falling in love with rakes and scoundrels. Honestly, it's now in the billionaire romance, isn't it? You know, as long as he's actually, the fact that the man is a rake and a scoundrel seems to make him more attractive. I don't get it, but then potentially I wouldn't. So, but when it did get published, it made so much money. The publisher was like, you know, we didn't really like this, but now we think it's a really great idea. So can you write more? We want it just the same but different. That's what they say. So, and then she had her mother and a sister, and she paid for them, and her ailing first husband. So she was, you know, people say it was beneath her true abilities, but she was the sole breadwinner. She was born in Hayling Island in Hampshire on the 1st of November 1885, but it wasn't a happy early life. Her parents separated a few years after her birth, and so moved round from cheap apartment to cheap apartment as her mother, Mrs. Vere Campbell, who was an aspiring but unsuccessful playwright, evaded what they call collection agents or bailiffs and relied on charity. So they were not rough as a badger's, think of a polite tale, but they you know, they were gentry, down on their luck. Yeah, I was going to say much as I'd like to claim I was, but I'm not. Neither down on my luck nor gentry. So Long's mother openly favoured other daughters rather than Margaret, who was Marjorie, who she found unattractive and unintelligent, which is clearly not true. So it's led to a grim childhood where avoiding blame was a primary goal. Her grandmother, or Nana, was described as slovenly, malicious, and skilled only in the intrigues of poverty. I think her father was an alcoholic who abandoned them. So she didn't have a lovely time, really. Her mother spent limited funds on the other daughter's schooling, so Margaret, largely taught herself, painstakingly deciphering words from the few books available. However, by her early teens, as we know that, 16, she writes this, she frequented the British Museum. That's why we had a library in it. You need to know that. It wasn't just like statues or Egyptian hieroglyphs. That would have been stunning if she'd managed to become a novelist by reading Egyptian hieroglyphs, but no, there was a library there, a British library in fact, immersing herself in history, art and culture. She's got that, hasn't it? It comes across, taking on small jobs as a fact checker. I thought that was a modern thing, fact checking, and I think it means something different. It was actually in the old days actually checking facts for books, you know, if they say that the French Revolution was such and such, to check the fact. I think that's the kind of job it was, rather than the modern fact checker, who seem to be going out of fashion. I'm glad I didn't train as one, being honest. Short-lived career. Anyway, so she was a ghostwriter. She paid for the family. It was considered amateurish, her first novel, but listen, you know, when it was finally published, it was moderately successful in the UK, but it was a bestseller in the US, transforming Long into a full-time writing machine. She actually didn't think she was that great, but but you can tell when she writes it. She's got a lot of craft there, you know. She knows how to write, I think. And she found relief in writing stories of revenge, murder and gothic horror, and she claimed it helped her rid her mind of dark thoughts. Same here, absolutely. Long married a Sicilian man in 1912 as more of an escape than out of love, and they were in Italy, and she soon became pregnant, and she wrote an account of her child's delivery at the hands of a superstitious and medically ignorant midwife, which is apparently terrifying. So her husband then rented a gloomy, unheatable place along the Ligurian coast that lacked food and sat near stagnant water. I'm not sure, you know, the houses usually do lack food until you take it into them, but it must mean something, that sentence, when I wrote it down. Her husband, who was never very healthy, quickly fell ill and not surprised, began to waste away. For over a year, Marjorie, Margaret, struggled to take care of him. She searched for food, haggled with pharmacists, she found wood for the stove, and kept writing. Long anticipated by her maid, found a professor to care for him. I don't know what that means. The romance with the professor, an elegant Venetian in his late 60s. So she obviously fell in love with this geezer, the professor's, and the affair was proper, and Long promised to marry him after returning to England with her son. However, she received a letter stating that his health was too poor to ever allow them to marry. A second marriage and 2 more children were quickly swept past in her book. I've made a mess of these notes. She later reflected that she should have known how to live simply and pleasantly, but her life was always cut across by the discords of other people's lives. So she wrote all her life and died in December 1952 at St Charles Hospital in Kensington following a fall in her bedroom. Now, I don't know anything about her, but she wasn't that old, was she? Yeah, so she's 15, so 16. No, 69. Often people who fall, this is a gross thing to say, but it's drink, Usually when we have people who were, when you're 80 odd or you fall, you lose your balance, but people who are younger who fall, particularly if you fall down the stairs and stuff like that, it's often to do with alcohol. There we are, a gross generalisation. Feel free to call me out on it, but I won't read your comments, so, but if you feel better doing it, then do. Let's talk about the Bishop of Hell. Oh, I need to say something about comments. I know, I don't want to whine about this because it's an unattractive quality. But I'm not an Jeffin robot. A lot of people have been saying this is dreadful AI, and the other anyway. So I'm not. So I've decided to combat this by leaving mistakes in. I used to be quite scrupulous about cleaning up the audio, but that seems to be playing against me, so I'm going to leave my mistakes in. I haven't left any swear words in though. When I get something wrong and I curse myself or punch the wall, and I've taken all that out. But I've left some of the slight stumbling over. When I made a real big hash of it, I did change it. Anyway, let's talk about the Bishop of Hell. Bishop of Hell came in 1949 in her collection, The Bishop of Hell and Other Stories. It's a great title for a story. She, by that time, was a very respected writer. It's a historical novel, isn't it, and it's a really interesting, the late 1700s, 1770s. We all know what happened in that period. First of all, the storming of the Bastille in 1789, which was the French Revolution, the sweeping away of the Ancien Régime, this period of several hundred years that was characterised by increasingly decadent aristocracy who were living a life of great wealth while ordinary people were suffering. And of course, across the water, the American Revolution. And it's slightly different context in that, the US may feel that it was, and it was, removing itself from autocratic power, but it was kind of the same kind of feelings that were going on in Paris. They're seeing these wealthy elites, as we might call them today, living at large, and the sweat of the work, all that tea tax and all that stuff. But being ruled by these people with nothing much to show for what you're paying them, and you're not having a great time. I think the French were having a worse time. Probably we, the peasantry of England, were having not too great a time either. But we can all play oppression bingo here. We can all kind of go worse for me, and you can say we were paying tax on tea. We were paying tax on tea. Do you know they used to smuggle it from the Isle of Man to our coast? And tea, you think, well, tea, so what? Tea was like heroin in its day. It apparently was much stronger then. It used to blow people's heads off. Not literally, but no, I don't think literally. Anyway, so that was bad. So that's when she's talking about when your man, Lord Culver, the swine Greatorix, is in Paris. and Paris is in a bit of a state because of the revolution. So that's the historical background. And I think we did one by her called The Housekeeper, which set it also in the 18th century with rakes. You wonder if I was going to say if her view of men was tainted by her experience of her father, but in this story, in fact, our narrator isn't a bad man really. He realised that he was evil, or he'd done bad things, and then he turned to the light and became a lawyer. That's a joke. No, I'm some of my best friends are lawyers. That's actually probably true, but anyway, that's another story. So I thought that this was really hard on Alicia Bulkley. Remember, this is a female author, and you know the sisterhood means all women have to be friends. And I don't think she was. I think she was really hard on Alicia Bulkley. She talks about her being, flat, ultimately vapid, empty, and she's so corruptible. I mean, her husband goes away. I mean, okay, fair enough, her husband's gone away for 3 years, but that does happen to people. And she loves him, and this complete naughty man comes and, he's just like, hey baby, come on. And where she's off with Lando. Terrible. Anyway, so I don't think she comes out very well, although he does feel pity for her, and I felt pity for her. I thought, poor lass, I thought. She's naive, isn't she? She's innocent. And so we can, but we have to take responsibility for our actions. She abandoned her husband and her children to run around with a complete wad around Europe. And couldn't she see that he was that? But maybe not because she was so naive. We've seen it all. We all have friends that have done that, don't we? Made complete fools of themselves about that. I mean, in many ways, there's a lot of Gothic in this. The decaying aristocracy. Look at Lord Culver there; they're corrupt. And I suppose this is an 18th century feature, isn't it? Which is no big surprise that it features in Gothic literature in the last half of the 18th century. The aristocracy are corrupt and debauched, and then we've got Lord Byron, who's into the early 19th century as well. But you know about the Hellfire Caves? So the Hellfire Caves are great. If you're ever in West Wickham in Buckinghamshire, you should go. I've been a couple of times, and this is where in the 18th century Sir Francis Dashwood, a prominent politician and founder of the Orders of the Friars of St Francis of Wickham, he wasn't really a religious man. It was kind of taking the pee out of religious orders, and he founded the Hellfire Club. And the chalk caves, and he got local workers to dig them out during a period of economic hardship. So that's actually quite nice, isn't it? And the caves became a meeting place for his own club, the Hellfire Club. And there were lots of influential figures, including politicians, writers and artists, and it was known for its satirical take on religious practices, basically mocking them, elaborate feasts, and, according to some accounts, orgies and black masses. Apparently there were, I don't know where I got this from, but I have this half remembrance of like naked women standing in alcoves, and so the chambers were decorated with pagan symbols, classical illusions, and sexually suggestive imagery. What's his name? Benjamin Franklin was believed to be one of its members. So it was there was lots of secrecy, but this would have got out, and so again going back to this theme of the corruption and debauchery of aristocracy. I think, other than that, this story is it's a moral tale, isn't it? It's a morality tale. You think that. But one thing I think is different is that usually in morality tales we're shown the good and the bad, and very often the people can redeem themselves and become good, and we see there is a force for good in the story. Now, I think that force for good is largely absent. It has some kind of wan and weak presence in our narrator, who is kind of our moral compass in a sense. He represents basic decency. He's a flawed man himself, but at least he isn't an absolute, monster like Greatorex, who is vile, isn't he? He's vile. And once again, I think we play around with ideas. This is a man born into privilege, who is given the gifts of great charisma, good looks, physical
attractiveness and prowess. He's a good shooter, and shootist, marksman. That's the one. And so, and yet, even so, he turns to, and I suppose that is the view. I mean, she wrote this in 200 years later, but I can imagine that your ordinary folk would look at, and we still probably do this, look at, and these were celebs. I mean, the Hellfire Club, we don't have to go very far before we're hearing like stories from Hollywood and amongst the rich and famous. They're doing stuff like this still, apparently. Well, and Epstein and all that, yeah, I think they still are, they're still doing it. It must be awful being so jaded by life that you have to do things like this to get a bit. Me, I just walk the dogs. If I see a goose, or I was out today and there was some pussy willow, they call it. On the willow trees, the little fluffy stuffs, and then the hanging catkins. And I'm like, yeah, this is glorious. It was even mildly sunny. It was 8 degrees centigrade, so it wasn't hot, but it was pleasant. But if I was Lord such and such, that wouldn't do for me. I'd have to be, these days I'd be taking loads of drugs, and God knows what I'd be doing, something dreadful. But in those days they would do what he did. I think but what we're saying is it's a damnation story. It's not a redemption story in the sense of a morality tale. It is a warning, a cautionary tale, if you like. It's more like those paintings in the churches where we see the sinners being boiled and prodded by devils. It's like, this is going to happen to you if you are. There's no redemption in the story itself, but it serves as a warning to us. Whether it served as a warning to people in the 1950s, maybe it did. Maybe there was still. I remember being young when I was just a little boy in the 60s and 70s, and certainly the idea of eternal punishment in hell was not. Yeah, kind of. That was the party line. That we believed it, So maybe there still was. I wonder if young people these days believe it. I suspect most of them don't. Anyway, but so that's its morality tale. The final sort of thing I want to say is about the standards of men and women in this, what they're expected to be, and I think there are two that are held up, and our characters fall short in both of them. So Alice Bulkley, we've already looked at how she falls short as a mother and a wife in her, and he pimps her out to various Italians for nothing wrong with Italians, don't be offended. Italians aren't offended about stuff like that, they're just too easy going. I'm not sure, are they French? Anyway, but maybe. But I'm hoping to go to France next year, and I'm quite a Francophile really, and an Italianophile. I'm an everythingophile, being honest with you. I'm a filey sort of person. But anyway, get back to the point, Tony. So, she falls short and she's weak, and so the highest virtue of a decent woman is to be a chaste wife, isn't it? And to fulfill her obligations as a mother and a wife, and be chaste and not be this voracious. I'm not sure she ever was. I think she was just a fool. But not to be a harlot. He accuses her of being a harlot, but who knows what happened in Italy? But maybe she technically was. But I think her failing in this is as a wife and mother, abandoning her children and her husband. Her husband comes across as solidly decent throughout, doesn't he? It's not even him going to India of his own volition, it's because he's got to go, it's his duty. So he's a big man for duty, Colonel Bulkley, and a good shot, as it turned out. And the fact he aims so that he ruins the face so he can't kiss another man's wife, I thought that was horrific, but nice touch. Anyway, what is the virtue of the man? The virtue that a man, and we see this, is he mustn't be a coward. So somebody says to you, you've got to fight a duel. It's about honour. You can't not do it. You've got to go. And if you, he would be ruined
if he didn't fight it, so he had to come back and fight it ultimately, even though he was a coward. To be a coward is worse than to be dead. It's massively dishonouring, you know. So those are the things. Whereas I think these days, if we were to transpose, I mean, I know she wrote it in 1949, but or slightly before. But if we were to transpose it from the late 1700s to modern times, and we were to hold men and women up to those standards, probably what we'd find would be that the idea of a woman abandoning her children, particularly, not necessarily a husband, but would still be seen as damning, really a real failing morally, even today. For a man not to fight a duel over his honour, I think would be, yeah, so what? Funnily enough, with all the stuff that's going on in the world, there was this guy on, I shouldn't watch this stuff, on YouTube, and he was going around in London and he was asking young men, because I think you may be aware that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has offered to send British soldiers. Anyway, never mind. But they're asking these young men, would you fight for England? And overwhelmingly no. So they just wouldn't. That's what they were saying. It's very. I mean, they said that before the First World War. Actually, most people before the Second World War. After the First World War, most people said no. But actually, when it came down to it, off they went. But yeah. But the point about those standards, really, if you were today, you don't fight the duel, or some guy calls you out and you don't stand up for it. It isn't as damning as a woman, you know, so the failings are not equivalent. I think in those days they were both equally tremendously damning, ruinous. But today, probably for a woman, that is still ruinous, less ruinous, if you can have such a thing. I think ruin is absolute, so a little, I don't know, not as bad. But for the man, being a coward's still not a great thing, but it's far more socially acceptable than it used to be. Okay, that's probably all I've got to say about it. I mean, I enjoyed the story. I will at some point return to pulp about, you know, hideous things going on in mounds and blasphemous, squamous entities from cultist universe of King Pong. I just made that word up. Anyway, hope you're all well. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, if you see any of my stuff pirated anywhere that isn't on one of my channels, just drop me a note and I'll try and get it taken down.